Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku had a light to follow part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story and a 45 word from AO3. So let's start the video. Do I believe that one without a power can become a hero? No, I should think not. A gruff voice said as Izuku looked up. Izuku asked as unknowingly tears fell from his eyes. It's not bad to dream, my boy, but sometimes some dreams are meant to never be attainable. Impossible by some others' views to grab their hands for. I would never forgive myself for sending a quirkless hero to take on a foe who had managed to give me this exceptionally fatal blow. It would be suicide for you and your obvious skills and observation to be placed on the front lines. So no, you cannot become a hero. The gruff voice said before leaving through a door. The boy stared off in the distance. Everything was ringing in his ears as all the events of his day came rolling back at him as he thought about whatever in the hell his life was building up to at this point. He asked the number 1 hero, All Might, if he could become a hero similar to him, and the man just told him that his dreams meant nothing in the face of those who could quite handedly overpower him due to an extra toe joint. Taking a deep breath, the young man glanced over the edge of the building, the words from his old friend / bully coming back up to bite him in the mind as his vision became blurry. Hey, there might be a way for you to become a hero. Pray for a quirk in your next life and jump off the roof. Maybe then you can become a hero. Kaken's voice rang in his head softly. Wiping the tears from his eyes, Izuku walked down the steps leading to the rooftop of the building he was on. Letting out a sad sigh of complete and utter hopelessness, he decided to walk home, completely and utterly unaware of the explosions happening off in the distance from his home. Walking through the streets of Mizudafu, he found that the streets were quieter than anything he'd ever seen before and decided to be more cautious about why he was walking home. Moving through the streets as though he were being watched, he finally made it to the street corner near his home, seeing the apartment building in the distance and beginning to rush towards it. He just wanted to lay down on his bed and believe that all today was being a nightmare that had never happened. All Might had always inspired others to become the best they could be. There was no way he could tell one of his biggest fans, albeit unknowingly, that he couldn't become a hero. When he wakes up the next morning, everything will be okay, he will be back to normal, and none of what happened today will even exist. Smack. Oh. Izuku mumbled, as he reached behind his neck and grabbing what hit him in the back of the neck. Pulling whatever it was from the back of his neck, he brought it up in front of his view. All before noticing something odd about how it looked. It was a tranquilizer dart, and he felt his vision slowly blurring again before he struggled to fight against the growing drowsiness. Turning around to see what was going on and who shot him, he found a white van moving in as fast as they could towards his direction and attempted to run away in a growing tenseness and fear. All before he tripped on the very ground he was struggling to walk on and slamming his face into the ground, knocking himself out. The last things he heard were the people who showed up at his nearly unconscious form. Damn, I didn't think he'd resist a tranquilizer dart meant for an elephant. Shut up, we need to get him to base. The voices rang out as he felt a bag being placed on his head. Unknown to everyone, his phone was laying on the ground as he was basically kidnapped. Along with his backpack, as it held the contents of his school day within, as well as a notebook that had burn marks all over it stating hero analysis for my future. 0W0. By the time Izuku woke up again, he found himself in a doctor's office. He didn't know where he was and immediately saw everyone in the room as a threat as he leaped from the table/bed he was on and moving into the corner of the room, hiding under anything he could place before him and those around him. His wary eyes looked around the area of the room, before noticing that there was nobody in the room with him, and those bodies that he'd seen were all in his imagination. His breathing increased heavily as he thought about why he was kidnapped on his way home from school itself. He didn't seem all that important. All those people who experimented on the quirkless were already in prison last he remembered. His breathing levels increased even more as he heard an EKG beeping very loudly as he yanked the things attached to his skin off roughly, leaving a couple of holes and blood seeping through. He glanced at his surroundings, as the EKG had a long beep sound signifying that caused the movement in the hall nearby to quickly head in its direction as Izuku tried his best to find a hiding spot. Eventually he got the bright idea to hide in one of the closets nearby as he took quick gulps of air in complete fear as he heard people rush into the room and look around the place. 𝗵𝗃. He was just here a moment ago. How did he escape? A voice called out. I don't care how he escaped. Make sure that he didn't leave the building. Because if he did, he'll be freezing his butt off out there. A feminine voice called out. As the two left the room, Izuku waited for a few moments to calm his raging heart as he took rapid deep breaths. He moved closer to the door as he found it slid open as though it were a futuristic kind of thing to do. Glancing down the halls on both ends, he found that they were empty, and he noticed that his clothing was only that of a hospital patient before moving down the hall. Slowly and cautiously, he moved down the halls trying to wrap his head around why these people needed him of all people and why they had an EKG strapped to his body. Unaware of the blood dripping from his he leading away from the office that he'd just left. For what seemed like hours, Izuku moved through the white walls and windows portraying a very Arctic climate outside. Izuku knew that he wouldn't be heading out there. He didn't even have the clothing for walking out there anyway. He just wanted to get his black Gakuren and just find a way to leave this place. Turning around a corner, he found another seemingly empty hall as he walked down it, following his gut as he tried to navigate around the halls in order to find an escape from this terrifying place. As he was walking down the halls, however, he heard a door a little way behind himself opens up and he looked around for a place to hide. Throwing caution to the wind, he tapped a door module a few times before it opened up in his panic and hid behind it. He heard someone talking in the hall as he placed a hand over his mouth to muffle his heavy breathing before he heard them walk away from the location, although not without them noticing some blood on the ground and leaving to go find someone to clean it up. Once they were gone, Izuku left the room and continued on his path towards a way out of this place that was until he came to a large area that was covered to the brim with tech. The door module definitely had a lot more tech compared to the others as he thought that this might be the way out of here. So as he rose a hand to mess with the module, the door surprisingly enough opened up revealing a young woman with white hair and red eyes. She glanced downward at the boy in front of her as she took in his appearance, his fretful eyes, that were slowly becoming pinpricks as fear bubbled in his heart. That was now rapidly beating. She stared at him for a moment, all before noticing that he was in the medical garb of a patient as she just began to glare at him with nothing more than annoyance. Before she could speak, however, Izuku ran off in the direction to her left in a vain attempt to escape from the scary lady. Because as soon as he reached the end of the hallway, a couple of guards arrived and saw him with a very scared expression on his face as they pulled out their weapons. Weird crystals. They pointed their hands at the boy and stated some words in a weird Latin phrasing as multiple weird blasts rushed towards him. Pulling his arms up to defend himself against the attacks, when not feeling any kind of pain at all, he looked at his arms before noticing how they glowed a light green color with weird pathways on them. He was so confused that he never noticed that a couple more guards came up from behind him with a nightstick striking him in the neck. He immediately fell to the ground unconscious as the woman walked up to them with a very annoyed expression. How in the hell did he escape from the lab? She growled. That's the thing, ma'am. We don't know. All we know is that he somehow vanished. One of the guards called out. I don't care, get Romani over here and tell him to get a better grip on one of our recruits. She growled out before walking back into her office. Once more, Izuku woke up to the smell of disinfectant and a white ceiling. Sitting up immediately, he found himself cuffed to the bed this time as he struggled to escape from the cuffs. That was when the door opened and a young man with light orange-colored hair and teal-colored eyes entered the room with a small notebook on hand. Izuku looked at the man with confusion at first before fear built up in his heart as soon as he noticed how he appeared closer to that of a doctor and hurried his attempts to escape. Hey, don't try and pull yourself out of those. You'll only hurt yourself. The man said, as Izuku glanced at him and every single exit he could find. What is going on? Where am I? And why am I still in this place? Izuku asked, fear writ in his features. Well, young man, if you can calm down I can assure you that I can answer your questions. The man said, placing the small notebook down. I can't do that, I don't know where I am, Izuku said, looking downright ready to just try any kind of attempt to escape. My name is Dr. Romani, and the place you're at right now is called Chaldea. It is the place where we travel through time to stop Holy Grail wars that shouldn't have happened. Dr. Romani introduced himself. Holy Grail wars. Time travel. What? Izuku questioned, now even more fearful. We found you on the road to your apartment, right? He asked, ignoring Izuku's questions. Why yes, but I was kidnapped, Izuku said as he remembered everything. I apologize about that. The people in charge of this place would rather you come with us rather than inform everyone outside of Chaldea, Dr. Romani said, as Izuku looked at him confusedly. What are you talking about? What's going on? Izuku asked, his heart, which was rapidly beating, slowed. Are you sure you want to know what happened? He asked, concerned. I was kidnapped for an unknown reason and was taken before I was questioned. Do I look like I don't want to know? Izuku said, nearly manic in his expression of fear. Right? Stupid question. Chaldea has been in search of MSDRs for saving the world, Romani said, as Izuku just stared at him with a confused expression. What do you mean by that? Izuku asked, sweat falling down the side of his head. What I mean by that is preventing the incineration of humanity. Because outside of Chaldea all of humanity has been destroyed, Romani said, as Izuku just sat there with a blank expression. The outside world is gone, Izuku asked, his face paling. All of it. Although for us, it would rather be frozen in time, Romani said, as Izuku stared at him in disbelief. How can I tell if you're not telling me a li right and now? Izuku asked, looking far more cautious. At that, Romani just lifted a data pad and turned on the big screen within the room as Izuku saw the entire world in ruins. He found that Romani was showing him the ruins of his home as it was now covered in vines and foliage. Not only that, but from what it appeared a massive battle took place in the area, and he felt even more tears falling down from his eyes. Looking at Romani, Izuku could only let out a few more words in a questionary manner. Does that mean everyone is dead? Izuku asked, his eyes now pinpricks. I apologize, but yes, he said as he turned off the screen. Romani left the room after that, letting out a massive sigh. He never thought that he'd have to lay it on the kid that his family is all gone. Not only that, but the world he had once known was gone. Izuku laid back down on the cot that was in the room, and which he was cuffed to, as he stared at the ceiling as though there was literally nothing left for him to live for. With Romani, the man made his way back to a big room where some of the MSDRs of Chaldea were waiting. Some had shifted to certain areas in time where they fought their foes in order to prevent the incineration of humanity. He glanced at the woman next to him. She had blue eyes and long brown hair that cascaded down to her lower back. The woman glanced over at him as well, and with a smile she sat down next to him as she took note of his grim expression and spoke to him. Romani, what's wrong? You look as though you've seen death itself again, she said with a little chuckle. I was forced to tell a 14-year-old kid that everything and everyone he knew is gone/dead. And that if we don't stop the incineration of humanity, it will remain that way forever, Romani said, with a deadpan expression. Ouch, that's bad news. How'd he take it? She asked. 𝗵𝗃𝗃, I know for a fact that you already know how he's feeling right now, Romani said, whilst rubbing his eyes. Alright, so he's not taking it well. Did you see what his magic circuits were all about? 𝗵𝗃𝗃 asked. That I already found out about. Apparently, he's got someone within his lineage who can use magecraft, although there's a problem, Romani said as 𝗵𝗃𝗃 looked at him confused. What's wrong? Is it something to do with his bloodline? She asked. No, actually. The problem right now though is his overall mental health, Romani said, as he gave her some files based on Izuku's life. Quirkless diagnosis at the age of 4, and for most of his life bullied relentlessly. That's not too different from some of our newest recruits, she said as Romani placed his head in his hands. I meant his mental health and physical health. From what it appears, his mental issues come from a life surrounded by those who really hated the quirkless. And the same goes for how he looks physically. Romani said, as 𝗬𝗏𝗃 took a look at the boy's file for his height. He's barely reaching 5 feet, that's not good. She muttered. That's only breaking the surface. His body is littered with scars that a 14-year-old boy shouldn't even have at his age, some of them go back around 5 years 𝗬𝗏𝗃. Romani vented. 5 years. Forgive me if I'm disbelieving, but that can't be possible. Scars fade after about a couple of years, but if what you're saying is true, that meant that he had to be constantly abused physically for you to be capable of seeing a 5-year-old scar. 𝗬𝗏𝗃 said, I want to know why Olga wants a mentally depressed child, not only that, but one that has absolutely every reason to not want to work with us. Romani growled as he slammed his fist onto the table. Am I allowed to speak? A meek voice called out behind them. Mesh, what's up? Romani asked, curiously hiding all anger and fury. 𝗬𝗵𝗃𝗃 has found the newest recruit and won't leave his hair, she said, as she pulled up a data pad with a camera pointed at Izuku and Vour. Izuku was just laying in the room looking completely dead inside, whilst Vour just was enjoying laying near the boy's head of green hair, even trying to eat some of it for and giggles. I swear, I will never know if that thing is more feline or canine. Romani grumbled under his breath as he stood up and left. Izuku sat in the office as he felt himself slowly regaining some semblance of calm over his mind. The simple fact that he'd been thinking so fast about everything that had happened in the past few hours, as well as those that had happened before he arrived at this weird place. The silence of the medical bay was enough to bring him to think about the whole day he'd gotten after he had the worst day of his life so far, and from how he felt in the moment he supposed that being kidnapped was par for the course. Of all the things to happen to him specifically, he thought that getting attacked by a villain, only to be saved by All Might himself, and then being told that he couldn't become a hero by the very same man, all before being kidnapped by a group of men in a white van and brought to a place he had no idea where he was. Yeah, one could say that today was the worst day of his life. Sighing in exasperation about why this was all happening to him specifically, Izuku felt something nudge him on the hip. Looking down, he found a small creature that looked similar to both a canine and feline in appearance alone, but felt as though it should have been something else, something far more dangerous than them. Taking a deep breath, he helped the small creature climb up him and he held it in his arms, all before it decided that hanging limply in Izuku's arms were not something that it wanted and took refuge in his hair. After a bit of struggle, of course. But Izuku didn't find it within his heart to care about that fact at this point in time. What was really on his mind at the moment was, well, how he was going to go on from here. His idol in everything heroics had basically told him to give up on his dreams of becoming a hero. And he was kidnapped by a group of people who were actually trying to save the world. At least that was what he got from the doctor that he could understand. He raised a hand and scratched the creature on his head, using it as a makeshift nest under its chin as it purred softly as he thought about his next idea for what to do here. Never before had someone grabbed him for a purpose, and he felt as though he'd be holding everyone back from their full potential if he stayed here. Although he preferred to just sit there and think, it wasn't until a few minutes later that a young woman entered the room looking for something. Vour, what are you doing here? A feminine voice asked, before looking at Izuku. I think he wanted to sleep in my hair. Izuku said with a shy wave. I'm so sorry about him. He's never done something like this before. The girl said as she rushed over to him, attempting to get Vour off his head. So his name is Vour? Izuku asked as his face became red from how close the girl was. Yeah, he suddenly appeared one day. And ever since he'd been by my side and helped me through some harsh times. The girl said with a small smile on her face. I can see that. Izuku said, reaching up and grabbing Vour and pulling them from his hair. It let out a whine of disapproval as Izuku just scratched it under its chin. All before giving Vour off to the girl as she grabbed the small creature softly, although when their hands touched slightly, a brief flash of a memory so fast that neither could recognize it for a moment moved through their eyes. Shaking their heads at that, the two just apologized to one another before Dr. Romani entered the room to see Vour trying to climb out of the girl's arms and onto Izuku's head. The man sighed in exasperation before walking over to Izuku and asking the girl to leave, giving her name as Mash. For the next few hours, Izuku was pushed through multiple tests to see if he was healthy and was let out once it was declared that he was. Although Dr. Romani wondered why Izuku was as short as he was, he never mentioned it as the young man just left the room in the clothes he was given. Of course, he was confused at the type of clothing he was given since it was slightly bigger on his relatively short and scrawny frame as it nearly slipped off his shoulders. He walked around the place to get a good look at it in order to see what his job around the place would be. Although he wished he could be more useful to them, he just kept to himself. From what it appeared, everyone was becoming tenser as time passed. Izuku didn't know if that was coming from his presence, but he just moved around as he explored it without the fact of guards coming after him and him being in a much calmer mindset. He arrived at a room where a group of people were standing in and watched from afar as a woman with white hair had been speaking to them all with a very serious expression before her eyes fell upon him, their newest recruit. She smirked somewhat maliciously before walking over to him, causing him to freeze as though he were prey in the eyes of a predator. Grabbing his shoulder with a palm, he winced slightly from the burn that was aggravated as she dragged him into the room. "All right, everyone, this is the newest recruit that Chaldea has managed to grab. His magic circuits have been giving us trouble finding them, but I hope you all treat him as though he were one of your own. Also make sure he's all caught up on what the plans are as a future 𝗵𝗃," the woman said, before leaving Izuku in the room. The room fell silent as soon as the woman left, and Izuku was looking even more scared and very uncomfortable until a young man walked up. He had long blonde hair and blue eyes, but his face showed an expression that was more serious than most of the others in the room as he stared down at the timid boy. Reaching a hand out in an act of pure curiosity, he began to speak to Izuku. "Hello there, my name is 𝗧𝗵𝗲, and I am the leader of the group of MSTRs who are within Cryptos. I hope you are ready for your job as a future MSTR of Chaldea," the man said with a small bow. "A future MSTR? What does that mean exactly? And what is happening right now?" Izuku asked, looking around the room as the other MSTR's candidates had left the room. "You're not aware of what we at Chaldea do here?" the young man 𝗧𝗵𝗲 asked. "And no, I was just taken from the street. I was on my way home from school," Izuku said as the man nodded. "Of course, as punctual as always. They really should be out there asking people to join rather than kidnap them," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 muttered before coughing slightly. "Anyway, what your job as a future MSTR within Chaldea is to eventually become powerful in magecraft and summon your own servant," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 informed as Izuku thought about it. "How am I supposed to do that?" Izuku asked as the man let him follow him out. "We use our Shielder class demi-servant magecraft in order to produce the item that is used for summoning. It can summon heroic spirits from a time that they had originally existed and pull them out so that we can receive help for stopping the end of humanity," 𝗧𝗵𝗲 explained as Izuku somehow produced a notebook and wrote this down. So what is the catalyst for such a summon?" Izuku asked as the man looked at him from the corner of his eye. "Well, we use Mash's shield in order to act as a catalyst. It can summon any servant within the past up till this time period, although I wish it was as predictable as it used to be," the man said with a sigh. As the two arrived at a massive room, they entered it and found multiple pods as a giant ball of flames coagulating in a circular motion was seen far below them through a glass floor. Izuku watched on in horror as he felt as though the glass would break, which caused him to walk silently around the place as 𝗧𝗵𝗲 watched with nothing more than a glance as he continued to talk about what Chaldea stands for. He spoke of how everything outside of Chaldea at this point in time is in danger of being incinerated due to an enemy who they are fighting. There wasn't much information that they could find on the person responsible. But Chaldea needed every single MSTR as possible in order to fight this new threat. Izuku watched on in awe as multiple MSTRs had come and gone through the doors of the area 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had shown him. The multiple pods gave him a very bad feeling about them since he'd lived in a society surrounded by less technology and more akin to tech centered around quirks. It was enough that Izuku looked at 𝗧𝗵𝗲 with a very concerned and worried expression as he tugged on the man's white jacket that seemed to just hang from his shoulders. He looked down at Izuku with eyes that were seemingly emotionless, but they showed a kindness he'd never seen from others before. "Did you know about the society I came from?" Izuku asked with a low voice. "Yes, I do. And personally, I think that having a quirk to be a hero is absurd. The term of hero has lost its meaning ever since quirks had come into play. But that's my personal opinion and you are entitled to your own. 𝗧𝗪𝗃 watched as Izuku's expression had multiple changes through emotions. The first was surprise, then it was guilt, moving on to disbelief, all before settling on acceptance. He'd never seen such emotions displayed on another MSDR's face in such a speed. He'd seen from Izuku that he was immediately worried about the boy's health, both physical and mental. He then spoke. I take it your experience with that kind of society wasn't very good. He questioned, although it was more like a statement. And not really. I wasn't treated as a normal human. But I'm pretty sure how I was treated was similar to others. Izuku said, his expression unsure of his own words. Well, I guess we should stop talking about that subject. It clearly hurts you too much to talk about. Anyway, the ray shift for the MSDRs and MASH will begin within the next couple of days. And I hope that you'll be ready by that time frame. 𝗧𝗪𝗃 said, before preparing to leave. What will I be doing? Izuku asked, confused. Oh, you'll be a part of my team. Learning the ropes from me. 𝗧𝗪𝗃 said with a small smile on his face. 0W0? Izuku was very confused the next day that he woke up within Chaldea. He had met 𝗧𝗪𝗃 the previous day and was deeply confused as to what he was supposed to do in preparation in how to become MSDR. He wasn't exactly given any instructions on what to do for that department, and he was given merely 48 hours before he had to be ready for anything and everything that could happen in that time frame. As he moved through the room that had been shown to him by Dr. Romani the previous night, the boy had been very leery of almost everything in Chaldea. That Dr. Romani was the only person Izuku allowed near himself. He found some books on the shelf nearby. He picked them up and saw that they were all notebooks, something that he felt his heart melt at. They at least thought about everything he'd loved in the past, about writing about heroes and villains he'd come across in his travels in Japan. He prepared to write down on it before realizing something. What in the world was he supposed to write inside of it? Well, since I'm writing in a notebook, I guess I can call this my diary. Gosh, it feels wrong calling it that, so I will be calling this my journal about life in Chaldea. From what it appears though, I am not allowed to leave the place and everyone expects me to know about how to be a MSDR by tomorrow morning. And personally, I have no idea what a MSDR is. All that I've been told by people, well, the only ones who I've managed to talk to me without my heart completely acting as though I'm running a marathon, is that 𝗵𝗃 is someone who controls a servant that they summon. How this is possible I still don't know, because that requires you to at least revive those servants from the dead if they really are what they call them. These heroic spirits. But if there was any kind of heroic spirit that I certainly hope to recruit to my cause, it has to be someone who actually wishes to protect humanity. Based on what everyone tells me, humanity is incinerated once we enter Chaldea, which greatly confuses me. I was just out there 2 days ago, having the worst day of my life so far, when I was kidnapped right off the street. So I have no idea what is right or wrong at this point in time. Izuku stopped writing as he stared at the paper, before closing the notebook and leaving the book itself on the desk. Taking a deep breath to try and calm his heart that had increased during his writing, he looked over to the door as he felt as though he really doesn't belong in a place like this. He'd been told time and time again that he didn't belong in this existence, much less alive for others to see it, and to see how these people said that they need him, it was making him very concerned. Mainly because of the fact that nobody wanted something from him unless he had something to give, and he was very worried about what they really wanted from him aside from him becoming a MSDR of Chaldea. As the boy continued to fall into despair within the confines of both his room and his mental battle, the door to his room had opened up. In strutted in the creature that he'd met the previous day. As it looked around the place, finding Izuku sitting on the ground in a corner of it, his eyes being the only thing that were glowing to represent his presence. Strutting over to the clearly panicking boy, it climbed onto his head and laid down purring, causing Izuku to fall out of his mental panic attack. Looking up, he found a face looking down at him with a worried expression, if an animal like foe could give one, as it tilted its head in front of his face. Picking up the animal and placing it on his lap, Izuku calmly rubbed the creature's back as he took deep intakes of air. He shook his head as the memories of his last couple days before arriving here passed through his mind, how he was ruthlessly beaten every day, how he was told that his existence would be better off non-existent. His confidence in what he could do was already below the mark where it should be, far below it in fact if he were to make a bar. But based on his experience in Chaldea, now that he thought about it, the only person who treated him like somewhat of an equal was 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗪, as the man had made sure to welcome Izuku warmly into their fold. Now though, the only thing on his mind was how to activate these magical circuits that the white-haired young woman talked about earlier yesterday. He looked at 𝗧, who was looking as though he were attempting to escape from Izuku's nervous, petting let the little animal go as it rushed off to find the person he belonged to. Shaking his head in exasperation, Izuku stood up and got his uniform on as he left the room itself and entered the hallway leading over to the simulator for MSDRs to take whenever they feel like it. As he walked through the halls, he found himself at the area where most of the other were taking their tests in the simulator. Entering the room, he found 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗪 looking around the place, as though he were looking for someone, and as he walked over the man looked at him and felt relieved. "Hey little guy, I'm sorry for not waking you up earlier. We come here to learn more about how to be a amateur, but if there's anything you need to know about these simulators, it's that anything that happens within it doesn't come out of it on the outside," 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗪 stated, as Izuku nodded. "Any questions?" he asked. What is it are supposed to do?" Izuku asked, cursing himself mentally for stuttering. 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗪 is someone who summons a servant for a holy grail war. But for Chaldea, they are someone who summons a servant to assist them in a singularity. Currently I'm waiting for the first ever ray shift in order to begin taking on the singularities. But within these singularities you can meet up with servants from previous holy grail wars and can make them your servants until you manage to escape from it, 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗪 informed. "Okay, I can get the general idea, but what happens at the end of a grail war?" Izuku asked, curious. "Well, at the end the holy grail is given to the winner, albeit with the death of the final servant of the war itself in order to grant any wish you might have," 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗪 said, as Izuku thought about it more. One last question, 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗪-san, what happens to those who don't have a wish? Izuku asked, as the young man gave him a concerned expression. "Did you not have a wish if you were to be brought into a holy grail war?" he asked, as Izuku shook his head. "The only thing I willingly wish for was either a quirk or a friend," Izuku said, as 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗪 just stared at him. "If you weren't being selfish with such a wish, what would you specifically wish for?" he asked, concerned. "Well, I wouldn't specifically have a wish. I'd rather give the wish to someone else," Izuku said, causing the man to stare at him in awe. Wow, Japan really is missing out on a potential hero student. Anyway, just place this device over your head and you can begin the simulations, 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗪 said, as Izuku followed his instructions. The boy was into different places around the simulations, and he was feeling completely confused by all kinds of information coming at him from all angles. They talked about how 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗪 should act when around a servant they summon, not only that how the servant was to be treated as nothing more than an enforcer of an army. This was something Izuku greatly disagreed with. Summoning a heroic spirit even if they were technically dead already, didn't sound right to treat them as nothing more than an actual servant for the rich. So when the question came to how he'd act around a servant, he specifically stated that he'd treat them as he would if they were alive. He'd treat them with kindness and then ask them for their autographs since they were very powerful and famous figures in the past, not to mention really recognizable people based on history itself. Once the whole simulation training as Anstar was over, Izuku stumbled out of the room to find that he had been in there for what appeared to be hours, as the entire day had come and gone in an instant. Something he hadn't been prepared for since he didn't expect to have been in that simulation for over 10 hours. Once he arrived within his bedroom at around midnight, he had laid down on his bed. He was about to close his eyes when he saw a weird set of eyes glaring down at him from the ceiling of the room itself, and getting up from the bed and walking to the light SW, he turned it on to reveal nothing was there. Shaking his head from the sheer suddenness of his mind slowly failing, he laid down on the bed after turning off the light and fell asleep almost as fast as all might were to say "I am here." As he slept, the figure who had hidden himself from Izuku's eyes had immediately fell to the ground before leaving, their closed eyes and fur collar having fluttered in the wind coming into the boy's room as the man chuckled to himself before heading down the hall. As for the sleeping boy, however, his dreams were filled with nothing more than fire and death. Izuku's dreams were filled with fire, not only that but the air was covered with a reddish-black smog that covered the sky. The city was burning, and as he looked around the area to see what in the hell was happening, he saw a figure stand out in the distance with a sickening smile on their face. It was so horrid and not what he expected of hero society that when the man revealed himself to him, Izuku was almost sick to his stomach as he stared at the very familiar face he'd once seen as a child. A face who had no freckles but covered instead with scarring all around the area where his eyes were supposed to be. His smile was a very sick rendition of All Might's as he held his dimples up so that he could keep the smile on his face. His suit was torn all over the place, and Izuku found himself knelt before the man. Man was smirking at him with all the malicious intent he could ever sense from him as he walked over to Izuku's kneeling form. The man stared down at Izuku with all the hatred a man, no monster could ever hold towards humanity as he spoke to Izuku in the dream almost as though Izuku was inside the man's mind. "Hello there, little one. Now where did you go? I thought you were supposed to stay near your mother," the man asked, as Izuku felt his entire form tremble in his presence. Izuku remained silent as the man chuckled again. "Well, if you don't wish to speak to me, then I will continue to speak to you. If you merely wish that saving humanity will stop me from destroying society as you know it, you are sorely mistaken. All I need to do is connect with your consciousness and I can find you," the man said, before his smile became mad. "Now though, I personally think that you should go back to that building. They need your assistance, little hero," the man said, before the fire and flames overtook the man. "Ďakujem." Izuku screamed as he fell out of his bed. Falling off the cot that was given to him, Izuku placed a hand over his eye. His breathing was all over the place. His breathing went from normal pace to a very rapid and small intakes as he trembled all over himself. His breathing shuddering as he tried to make sense of whatever that dream was, and what that meant for him if that man was going to come to Chaldea. But if there was any consolation, he knew that the man wouldn't ever find Chaldea considering the fact that he was all the way back in Japan. How Izuku knew this he wouldn't ever know, but he felt it was true. Once he left the bedroom, his eyes had bags under them as he walked through the building. His uniform was on, and it looked as though he did it without much thought considering it was very loose on his body as he walked through the halls. His eyes were fluttering as he shook his head, before he collapsed onto the ground and passed out from lack of sleep. And it would remain that way until it was time for the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 project to begin and see if anyone can do anything to help history stay the same and prevent the incineration of humanity. He felt something his face, and as he slowly woke up, he found Mash standing in front of him. But for some reason all his memories of the young woman in front of him, especially her name, had been lost to him as he slowly sat upright, bags still under his eyes as the girl fretted over him. "Senpai, are you all right?" the girl asked. "Am I dreaming?" Izuku asked as the girl tilted her head at him. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Because I'm seeing an angel right now," Izuku said, bluntly without a stutter. Blushing Mash just shook her head as she helped him stand upright once more. "No, I'm not an angel. But did you forget my name?" she asked, concerned. "I couldn't remember anything for a moment there. Why, your name is Emash, right?" Izuku asked as the girl nodded. "Are you doing okay, senpai?" she asked, concern in her tone. I should be. But what is going on right now?" Izuku asked, feeling even more tired than before. "The 𝗧𝗵𝗃 project is about to begin. We're going to be ray-shifting into the Fuyuki singularity," Mash informed as Izuku followed her towards the ray-shifting room. 0W0. Izuku and Mash arrived at the ray-shifting room as Vour jumped from Mash's shoulder and left the room. By the time they reached the room, Izuku was told to stay inside of the main room where the people watching the ray-shifting project take place. So as he bade his farewell to Mash, he entered the room to find the white-haired woman staring at him with a very angered expression as Izuku leant backwards to keep her face as far away from his own as possible. "Do you know how long we've been waiting for you? Come on, you need to be prepared for this," the woman said, as Izuku nodded slightly out of fear. "Commence the ray-shift," the woman said as the few other people in the room nodded. "Commencing the ray-shift program." beginning with Group AD. Then finally with the cryptors, all signs are showing that everything is a-okay. Romani said from his side. As the room began to glow a blue light, Izuku felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It always happened whenever something bad was going to happen, and as soon as that feeling arrived the entire room was bathed in a massive explosion as Izuku was blasted out of the room itself. As soon as that had happened, the boy's vision had failed him for all but a few minutes and he fell into a small nap through hitting his head on the wall behind himself. He woke up again to the distinct sounds of foe chirping in his ear trying to wake him up, and as he roused from his slumber, Izuku noticed how much smoke was in the air. Placing the collar of his uniform over his mouth, he coughed slightly before rushing into the ray-shifting room to see if there were any survivors. As he ran through the room, he saw way too many bodies lying on the ground, either with most of their bodies burnt beyond repair, or they had been bleeding out on the ground with no way to save them from death. Izuku searched for someone to help and save from the fires and flames when he heard the sound of Masha's voice grunting in pain. Running over to where he heard her voice, he found a massive pillar that had once been inside the wall on the left-hand side of the room on her legs. His pupils shrunk in size as he rushed over to her with foe on his shoulder as he placed his hands under the pillar and lifted as much as he could. "Senpai, why you need to get out of here?" Mash said, blood flowing from below in her mouth. "I won't leave you behind, Mash," Izuku yelled, as he yanked on the pillar as strong as he could. "Senpai, why you need to worry about yourself?" Mash tried to say, before Izuku looked into her eyes. "Mash, I need you to at least try and push up. I can't save you if you won't try," Izuku said, looking into her eyes. She looked back into his emerald eyes as she looked at his downright fearful gaze, all before she tried her best to lift the pillar as well. As Izuku pulled up with all of his scrawny might, he watched as the pillar seemed to move upright a bit as Mash attempted to move forward. All before the pillar fell back onto her back and rear, as she let out a pained yelp as Izuku did his best to try and at least save her more. He ran over and grabbed some metal in order to try and lever the pillar up and allow Mash some space to escape, but it was no use. "Senpai, just let me go save Why yourself," Mash begged as Izuku shook his head. "I can't leave Why you like this," Izuku said as the fires got closer to them. Unaware of what was happening beneath them both, the blue light was beginning to cover Izuku and Mash. "Can you stay with me then? F for 𝗬𝗪𝗏 go," Mash asked, looking into his eyes. "Why yeah, but you won't die," Izuku said, tears flowing from his eyes. As the two stared into one another's eyes, Izuku felt a burning sensation on his right hand before the room became enveloped in a blue glow. And within seconds, the two who were standing within the ray-shifting room had disappeared from existence, as the pillar fell through the floor after the two disappeared from the room itself. 0W0, Izuku felt himself falling through the air. As he fell, he found himself closing in towards the ground at a rapid pace. Flailing his arms about in a way to try and slow down his fall, something rammed right into his stomach, causing him to cough out spittle and pushing all the air out of his lungs as the wind flew past him. And with a small cloud of dust, he hit the ground with something on top of him as he groaned in pain before he tried to sit up, only to find that something, or rather, someone was laying on top of him. He felt something soft over his lower body as he blushed crimson before looking at who was laying on top of him. Mash was shown to be laying on top of him, whilst holding a massive shield in her other hand that laid right next to his body. She woke up from her slumber as she looked at Izuku's massively blushing face as she sat upright, accidentally smacking him in the head as the two held onto their heads in unison. That was until they heard a scream coming from down the road, knocking the two out of their pain, and the two nodded at one another, holding back the panic that was what in the world was happening. Running down the road, they found a somewhat comedic scene of the director of Chaldea running back and forth down a couple streets with a small smoke cloud coming up behind them. Sweat dropping at what they were seeing, Izuku gave a glance at Mash as the girl rose her shield up in front of them both. That was when the director ran over to him and hid behind the shield, asking for the two of them to protect her from any and all harm, and not taking those words for granted, Izuku ordered Mash to take care of the enemies. With Mash fighting off the enemies, Izuku glanced back over at the director as she looked as though she was scared. So he knelt to be at her height as the woman was on the ground sitting on her knees looking at 𝗵 fight with fear written in her expression. "Why, you're the director of Chaldea, right?" Izuku asked, bringing the woman's attention over to him. "Yes. What in the hell are you doing here though?" the director asked, slightly angered. "I went to try and help some of the survivors, but I only found 𝗵. Then the room became covered in a blue glow, and we showed up here," Izuku said, rubbing the back of his head. Of course I have to be here with the one person who has no idea what they're doing," the director said, as Izuku frowned a bit. "I may not know what I'm doing, but 𝗵 appears to be having fun out there," Izuku said, pointing at 𝗵 who was smashing the skeletal warriors with ease with a happy expression on her face. The director just stared at the scene before her with nothing more than a blank face before looking at Izuku, who appeared to be more confident at the moment. That was until she spoke again. "Okay, so what if 𝗵 is taking care of the enemies? What are you going to do when you are all alone without her presence?" the director questioned. I don't know, you should have known that I'm not as suited for this. I'm just pushing the fear I have down at the moment," Izuku said, before focusing on how 𝗵 was on her way back. Once she got back, the trio had decided to make their way through the burning city and black smog covering the sky. They looked around for a ley line in order to make a small base of operations to prevent the singularity from becoming far worse than it was supposed to be. And all throughout the entire city, the trio fought for their lives, taking on skeletal warriors as well as being trailed by shadow servants. They were able to lose 2 of the 3, but the 4th was there and chasing after them, or more specifically Izuku, as the young man was seriously considering why he was even brought here. The shadow servant had swung a short blade towards Izuku as the young man dodged just by a hair. 𝗵 then went into the defense as she blocked the first attack before the shadow servant had kicked her shield, knocking the 2 back as they bounced across the ground before stopping at a wall. The shadow servant then began to create small portals to send swords of many types towards the 2 before something landed in front of the 2 with a giant tree blocking the attack. Looking up, they found a man with blue hair in a braid as his clothes indicated that he was from the northern peninsula of Britannia. He looked over his shoulder and gave the 2 a knowing smirk before she spoke. "Hello there, kids. Need a hand?" he asked. The blue-haired man stood in front of them, a magical barrier protecting them from the broken noble phantasm. He stood firm as he held his wooden staff in the air as he projected a weird-looking rune to protect them all from the attack of the shadow archer. He grunted with effort as the 2 just stared at him in awe. That was before he spoke out loud for the 2 of them to hear him, catching them both off guard. "Hey, I know that I'm pretty and everything, but I'm kinda in the mood to just retreat right about now," the man called out. "Sorry. What do you need help with?" Izuku called out with some slight fear in his tone. "What I need right about now is someone with enough magical energy to keep me in this world. Think one of you can do that?" the man asked, as Izuku looked at 𝗵 with an uncertain expression. "You won't be trying to kill us if we accept you into our group, right?" 𝗵 asked, concerned. "What? Who do you guys take me for, the devil?" the man asked, as he grunted with effort to hold back the broken phantasm. "Well, this is my first time as a emissary of Chaldea," Izuku said, as the blue-haired man gave him an exasperated expression. "You know what? If we manage to survive this mess, I will be giving you both a rundown of what a Holy Grail war is and making sure that it stays in your mind for future adventures," the man said, before pushing as much power into the barrier as possible. "Okay, let's just focus on getting out of here then," 𝗵 called out, as Izuku prepared to grab Olga. They both turned around to grab Olga, only to find the outline of where Olga was supposed to be as the woman was already hightailing it out of there. She was even leaving behind a comedic smoke trail to let them know which direction she ran off to. Looking at one another, Izuku and 𝗵 had rushed off, allowing the caster servant to drop his barrier and rush after them both in an attempt to escape the shadow archer servant. And from what it appeared, they had managed to escape through the cover of the smoke cloud from the explosion coming from Archer's attack. For a few minutes the trio had rushed down the road, only to find Olga having defeated her own set of skeletal warriors. She was heavily, but as she looked at the trio she ran over to them and just slapped the backsides of their head in her fury of having to fight all on her own. This was where the blue-haired magician had decided to interject into the argument and be on the side of Izuku, who had quite literally done nothing wrong to begin with. Hey, just because he wasn't there to protect you that time doesn't mean he won't be in the future, the man said as Olga moved her eyes to him. And you, who in the hell are you? She called out, as the young man just stared at her with a confused expression. Should I tell her my name, or should I let the kid who looks like he's about to have a brain aneurysm from the look he's giving her? The man asked, as Mash looked over at Izuku. The boy was staring at Olga with what appeared to be an appalled expression on his face. Olga looked over briefly and found that the boy was indeed giving her that expression of complete bewilderment as well as shock written on his features. All before he began to speak to the woman. Director-san, how can you not know who he is? He's extremely famous in the legend of 𝗧𝗵𝗃. Izuku called out, as the woman gained a confused expression. How do you know who he is then? She asked, looking at him. Before you all kidnapped me from my way home, I had a lot of time to study on heroes before the age of quirks. Izuku spoke without a stutter. I told them not to kidnap anyone. It's not my fault that you have a very good set of magic circuits. Olga called out indignantly. Senpai, can you tell us who Heichi is? Mash asked, a little bit wary of his sudden awe. Of course. He's the famed student of 𝗧𝗵𝗃, the one who once held the powerful spear, 𝗬𝗏𝗏. Izuku said, with a very odd and happy expression on his face. What is his name though? Olga questioned. He's 𝗬𝗪𝗓𝗏, the famed spearman who was named the Child of Light from Ireland. Not only that, but his mother was immortal whilst his father was their god of the sun, Izuku said, excitedly. 𝗬𝗪 just stared at the boy list off a few things from his life and couldn't help but chuckle. All before he watched the boy ruffle around with his uniform for a second, before quite literally summoning a notebook from right out of his butt. It was scuffed, but at the same time waterlogged. It was concerning because of the burn marks all over it as the boy held it out to him with a pen and a starry-eyed expression taking over his entire mood. Can you sign this? The boy asked, excited. Well, I don't see why not. But I don't have 𝗬𝗏𝗏 with me. If I had it with me, this would have been far easier for me to deal with. The man said with a sigh. So, with the robes and the staff, that means you're a caster servant, right? Mash asked. Yup, and it was just my luck to be summoned as a servant in the caster class. My MSTR taught me everything she knew about the Nordic runes she had learnt in her entire life, but I wasn't really paying much attention to that at the time. I was more focused on learning how to be the best spearman in the entirety of Ireland. 𝗬𝗪 said with a chuckle before handing Izuku his notebook back. Izuku stared at the man's name as he soon looked at the previous page of the notebook itself. 𝗬𝗪, Mash and Olga watched as his excited demeanor had suddenly disappeared and was replaced with a very sad expression. One that he had immediately changed to that of a neutral expression as he placed his notebook away behind the shirt of his uniform for Chaldea. Olga and Mash gave each other a glance of acknowledgement before looking at Izuku with a worried expression. That was before 𝗬𝗪 entered the conversation once again. Anyway, so as thanks for saving your lives, think you can make me your servant, so I don't disappear from the world? 𝗬𝗪 asked, as Izuku moved over and held a hand out. Sure thing. I hope I have enough magical energy to supply your stay here. Izuku said, as 𝗬𝗪 shook his hand. The two felt the connection of Izuku's energy into 𝗬𝗪𝗓𝗏's whole connection into this world. He chuckled a bit before looking at the girls with an expression that was odd for even himself to have in this kind of singularity. So, what do you think the plan will be now that we've been contracted to work together? 𝗬𝗪 asked as Izuku sat down and thought about it. Well, we could always try and find the Holy Grail. It was why we came here in the first place. But then again, we'd be looking all over the place for it, and that could take literal days before we can even find it. But that remains to ask the question of where it even is in the first place. Izuku muttered, as he rubbed his chin with his index finger. The others just watched the boy mutter to himself as 𝗬𝗪 just had a smile on his face. He glanced at the two women who were standing near him and gave them a wink before speaking aloud to the two of them whilst allowing Izuku his time to think about a plan. Now that the boy is sufficiently distracted from us, we need to talk about what we just saw him do, 𝗬𝗪 said, expression grim. Yeah, what kind of emotional change was that? He went from happy to sad so fast it was strong to tell if he was faking it. Olga mumbled. See, could it have to do with what he was doing before he arrived at Chaldea, director? Mash asked as Olga thought about it. It couldn't be that. He was on his way home from school based on what my men told me. Olga said as Mash thought about it a bit more. How about this? What if your men only found him when he appeared to be walking home? How did he react to arriving at Chaldea in the first place? 𝗬𝗠 asked. He was rightfully skittish as well as very scared. He walked out of the infirmary and tried to find an exit as soon as he woke up. Mash said as 𝗬𝗠 nodded. Now what kind of society did he live in before you all basically kidnapped him from his way home again? 𝗬𝗠 questioned a bit further. The man was going to only let them figure it out on their own. Just from connecting to the boy's hand he had a very brief flash of the boy's worst moment. And needless to say, he was already hopping to use some runes on a certain Pomeranian mad dog of a human being whose name started with AK and ended with an O. As the two girls were thinking about it, they weren't really drawing a connection with the question at hand until 𝗬𝗠 looked over at Izuku as they saw him still muttering to himself. Mash then remembered what Romani stated before they set up the ray-shifting program that morning. Mash, I don't know what he's told you. But Midoriya just won't talk about his life before coming here. Yeah, he's only been here for only about 56 hours, but there is something clearly wrong with him. He's got scars on his body that lasted all the way until he was only around 6 years old. A child at that age shouldn't even have scars like that. Romani's words rang in her mind. Wait, Olga, what are the statistics of those who are born quirkless? Mash suddenly asked. What are you talking about? Aren't there no statistics for them at all? Olga questioned. Please just try and find out about it. Mash urgently stated. The woman pulled out her phone as Dr. Romani actually entered the conversation. Apparently, they were on a ley line of magic so they could connect with him. You need some information about the Holy Grail. Romani's voice rang out, which coincidentally caught Izuku out of his muttering spree. Dr. Romani. I didn't know you could contact us right now. Izuku said as the man chuckled. Don't worry, Izuku, you all are on a ley line of magical energy. It allowed me to connect to your tools that allow me to talk to you all. In terms of where you all need to go, you need to head over to Mt. Enzo. I'm getting a massive energy reading from there. It might be where the Holy Grail that you need to collect is located currently. But there is another problem, Dr. Romani said, as Izuku sighed in exasperation. When will there be good news? Izuku asked as he placed his hands over his face. You haven't even been with us too long to even ask that, kid, but anyway, there's a servant there and they are extremely powerful. So be on the lookout. Dr. Romani said, as Izuku gave the man a small salute. Hey kid, come with me a second, I'd like to know more about the future where you're from. 𝗬𝗠 said, pulling Izuku away from the two girls and Romani. Okay, but let's not stray too far. Izuku said, a bit warily. Don't worry about it, kid, just loosen up a bit. We've got a little while before the fight begins. 𝗬𝗠 said, brushing off Izuku's worry. With that said and done, 𝗬𝗠 looked over his shoulders and gave the girls a wink to allow them to speak with Romani. And as the two boys walked away but not too far away to where they wouldn't hear them call for help should they require it, Romani spoke up to the two of them. Is there something else you wanted to know? Romani asked. Yes, can you do a checkup on the quirkless statistics of the outside world from Chaldea? Olga asked, concerned. I can, but it might take a few minutes. Or probably none at all. Jesus, this is just horrible. Romani said as he held a small tablet in his hand through the hologram. What's wrong, Romani? Mash asked, worried. It's just that there's no information from the Japanese about the quirkless. But when compared to the other countries of the world, their statistics state that everything is fine with the quirkless. But after having Da Vinci dig a bit from her end, you're not going to like what I'm seeing right now. Romani said with a grimace. What's wrong? Olga asked. There's hundreds, if not thousands of articles talking about those who are quirkless being hunted down and killed. Not to mention that those who support quirk supremacy laws are trying to ban quirkless humans from even existing in the world at all, even going as far as to make their lives a living hell. Romani said with a slight gulp. Is there anything else you can find, Romani? Olga asked, now looking over at Izuku as the young man was talking to the older hero about the heroes of his time. Yeah, but it's not good, Romani said, wincing. Well, to get on with it. Olga growled out. But, Jesus. I found some statistics from an underground hero in Japan. Goes by the name of Eraserhead. I'm not sure why he named himself that, probably to hide his real identity, but from what he's written down in an article he's witnessed hundreds of kids without quirks kill themselves before they even reach the age of 10. And how old is Izuku right now? Romani questioned as Olga thought about it. He doesn't even look more than the age of 12. Olga said as Romani shook his head. Isn't he around 13? Mash asked as Romani nodded. His height was stunted due to his surroundings and inability to eat a whole lot. I've hacked into the school he went to, and their cameras aren't very good with their firewalls, and his school life was pretty much non-existent. If you forego the whole bullying and suicide baiting he got just 2 days ago. Da Vinci's voice said, from the hologram. Wait, when we took him in he was suicide baited. Olga yelled, unaware that it caught the attention of Izuku and 𝗬𝗪, who looked at them in confusion. Izuku looked ready to head back over there and see what the girls were talking about, but they were interrupted by the incoming sound of marching, and turning to look at what was incoming, they found hundreds of skeletal warriors walking towards them with expressionless eyes and faces, and a shadow servant following not far behind them. Izuku sent 𝗬𝗪 out to fight the skeletal warriors and the shadow servant. He wasn't sure who they were as they were feminine and had a long staff with a sickle at the end of it. Running towards the girls, he managed to hear the end of their conversation. Well, let's hope that he can open up to us about his past a bit more when he gets back from this. Romani's voice rang out, before it fizzled out of existence. Director-san. Skeletal warriors and a shadow servant are here. Izuku called out as the two immediately got into fight or flight mode. Mash immediately rushed around to help 𝗬𝗪 as Izuku stayed near Olga as the woman appeared to be nearing a panic attack from the number of times they were attacked in one day. Izuku helped her move across the increasing danger of the battlefield, and with Mashu and 𝗬𝗪 moving about the place protecting them from one of the shadow servants, they came across the archer servant who was looking at them with a very crude expression on his face. He wasn't glaring at them, just staring at them with curiosity at best. What is your end goal of this singularity? He asked as Izuku looked at him. Who are you talking to? Izuku asked as Archer jumped down from his elevated position. I'm talking to the emissary of Chaldea. He said, pointing his weapon at the boy in question. What do you mean by that? Olga asked as the man glared at her. I wasn't asking you, woman. I was asking the emissary of Chaldea. The archer stated, pointing his blade at Izuku. We're trying to save humanity. It gets incinerated in the future. Izuku said as the archer thought about his own answer. If you were to win the Holy Grail, what is your wish? He asked again, this time in a more solemn tone. I don't care about a wish granting device. Besides, I have no dreams anymore. Izuku said, looking down. You wouldn't be a MSTR if you didn't have at least one dream, kid. I know the look you are trying to keep hidden beneath your skin. You wish to be a hero, don't you? Archer questioned. Does it matter? I can't be one anyway. Izuku said before looking at Archer. Whoever said that you cannot become a hero is full of SHT. Anyone can become a hero if they put their mind, heart and soul into their motivation to become a hero. Now tell me, if you were to win the Holy Grail, what kind of wish would you make? Archer asked. I'd give the wish to someone else. They'd need it far more than I ever would. Izuku said, as Archer watched him closely. There was no more words being said between the two, and surprisingly Archer lowered his weapon. And he began to walk away, as his body began to disappear into motes of golden light, but he looked over his shoulder to tell the Chaldea survivors a warning. If you wish to enter MT Enzo and get the Holy Grail, you better know that you will need to fight like hell. Because Saber is there protecting it with her life. She killed her previous emissary just to be capable of using it. Archer said, disappearing fully. Saber is guarding the Holy Grail. Well, we're downright Olga said, before slapping a hand over her eyes with a groan. Surely we can beat her, right? Izuku asked, looking at Olga. Right. Izuku asked as the woman glared at him. We're so dead, we're going to die and it will be all your fault. Olga growled under her breath, causing Izuku to look at her funny. What are you looking at me like that for? She asked. Well, I didn't want to ruin your moment, but Mash and 𝗬𝗂 have returned. Izuku said, as the woman looked over her shoulder to see Mash standing there with a confused expression. Although 𝗬𝗂 was giving her a disapproving expression as they traveled across the bridge. Izuku had done a small head count on the whole shadow servants that had attacked them. It was Lancer, Archer, Rider and Assassin that only left Saber, Caster who was with them but not a Shadow, and Berserker. Izuku looked around the area, before glancing over at 𝗬𝗂 who was looking around the area as well before noticing Izuku's eyes on him. Is there something you need to know, 𝗵𝗃? 𝗬𝗂 asked, as Izuku blushed crimson. Please don't call me that. I feel embarrassed for someone as cool as why you call 𝗵𝗃. Izuku said, embarrassedly. Hee, don't worry about that, kid. It'll grow on you, just you wait and see. But anyway, I think I know where we'll find Berserker. Caster said, as they arrived at a tunnel leading into 𝗵𝗃. Please tell me that Berserker isn't inside here. Izuku asked, looking at Mash and 𝗬𝗂. Well, I can't say that he's in there, but at the same time I can't say that he isn't in there. 𝗬𝗂 said as Izuku slumped. Well, not time like the present to see if we can actually have some good luck. Izuku mumbled before they entered the cave. Not too far away, a very tall and buff individual stared at the small squad entering the tunnel. He growled ominously as he stepped towards the tunnel, his feet slamming into the ground with terrifying cracks as his muscles contracted, creating a very disturbing sound of RBB being ground up. As the group headed down the deep dark tunnel, Izuku was beginning to think things through. Everything in his life was apparently leading up to this very moment within this singularity, something he still had no idea what in the hell he was doing but was just going with the flow. His mother always told him that he was adaptive to whatever situation she'd ever given him growing up. He just hoped that his adaptive abilities could assist him in this event at the moment. Well, because there was a literal demon from hell chasing them down through this god-forsaken tunnel. Grail. Heracles' shadow servant form called out from behind. How in the world did we not see him? He's freaking huge. Izuku screamed as he, Olga and Mash comedically ran down the tunnel with Caster not too far behind them. Maybe he had the chance to hide his presence. Olga questioned whilst running. But from what you say that's impossible since he's a Berserker class enemy. Izuku screamed out, as he dodged a 𝗧𝗵𝗲 flung in his direction. 𝗵𝗃. I didn't want to fight Berserker right now. Caster yelled as he created a rune to protect them from Berserker for the moment. Why is he so focused on me right now? Izuku whined as they ran through the tunnel. Hey, you brought this upon yourself. You came into the room to save Mashu. Olga called out as Izuku gave her a flat look. What was I supposed to do there? There was fire everywhere, and she was in pain. Izuku screamed out in panic. The group had continued to run through the tunnels, taking multiple entryways into other tunnels leading Berserker down a different path each time. And as they continued to run in fear of the Berserker, they heard him begin to break down the tunnel they were rushing through, but his incessant growling and roars were soon gone from their ears. Apparently, Berserker hit a massive amount of rock and rubble and caused the tunnel to collapse and block his way to them. At least they hoped that was what exactly happened since he didn't show up at any more forks in the road. Okay, we need to calm down. 𝗬𝗂 called out as he caught up with the others. I can't breathe. Izuku muttered out as his panic soared higher. Mash moved closer to Izuku as she rubbed the boy's back as he continuously tried to calm down his raging heart. 𝗬𝗂 moved over as well as he used some rune to increase Izuku's calmness of mind and body as he slowly began to slump towards the ground before he took a knee and placed a hand over his head. Once that was done, Izuku sat down on the ground before looking at the opposing wall as he checked the time that was given to them via a technological watch connected to Chaldea. Looking at the time, he was horrified with what the time was over there. It hadn't even been 5 hours since they'd arrived here, and all this chaos had happened. Tea time is confusing. Izuku muttered as Olga glared at him. What was with you screaming back there? Olga asked, angrily. I'm sorry if IW was worried about G getting away from a L literal servant who could K kill us without a S second thought. Izuku barked back. But that doesn't mean that you can run faster than me. What in the hell got into you to run faster than me? I thought you didn't work out. Olga yelled at him. I'm just very well practiced. Izuku said, looking away with a blush. Sure, practiced. Olga grumbled before looking at the ground. They all remained quiet as they gathered their strength and magical energy. Izuku though was getting antsy as he pulled out the notebook from earlier as his hands twitched and trembled with each and every motion. He'd moved his hand in order to grab at it. As he held it close to his ear, he felt himself relax slightly as he opened it up and turned to a new page, randomly manifesting a pen into his hand, greatly confusing his peers who were watching him do this. The boy began to record their experience in the notebook as though he were going to copy it later on, and he was breathing heavily as he did this before he closed the notebook and placed it back where he'd gotten it originally. That was until he noticed everyone's vision all placed on him. What? Izuku asked, confused. How do you manifest things that you didn't even bring with you? Olga asked as Izuku just stared at her. Oh, are you talking about the pen? Izuku asked as Olga nodded. I had that on me the entire tea time. Izuku said, as Olga just stared at him in disbelief. What's next? You going to say you brought lunch with you? You questioned with a mirth in his eyes. Actually I did. Izuku said, somehow pulling multiple bentos from his back pocket. The others just stared at him as though he were the creator of a dimensional pocket that had just manifested itself as his main ability. Are you sure that you're not a servant? Mashu asked, concerned. Why I'm sure. I can't use a magic like CCU and I'm not nearly as strong as 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗄. Not as smart as most people though. Izuku said, looking away. I'm just average. Izuku said, rubbing his finger in the ground in a circular motion. Alright, you all fix your problems with one another. I'll keep watch on the tunnel system. You said, stretching his body after eating some food. I don't have a problem with everyone. Izuku said indignantly. Yeah, you might not have a problem with the others, but they might have a problem with you. You said, bluntly as Izuku looked at the two girls. One looked at him with sympathy and sadness, whilst the other was looking away in clear embarrassment from being found out. Izuku sighed and pulled his knees up to his ear. If they had the time for a break, they had the time to talk this problem out of existence. The more people who stopped caring about his well-being, the more normal things could get in his opinion. And as he waited for the two women to speak, he watched as Mashu spoke up first, since Olga was clearly going to wait until they've said their piece. Senpai, can you tell me why you don't like talking about your past? Mashu asked, as Izuku glanced at her. Izuku remained as quiet as possible, mainly because he was surprised by her question and how blunt it was. Although, he really wanted to gather his thoughts in order to answer her question in the best way possible without making it appear as though he wanted to be helped by her, he didn't want to burden her with his past. In his eyes, he wasn't as important as everyone else present in the tunnel at this particular moment in time. My life hasn't been the best. But I'm sure that others are having a far worse time than I did. I would just rather forget about it, keep it out of mind. Izuku stated as Mashu stared into his eyes. She knew he wasn't telling the full truth, but she really hoped that he would eventually inform her about this past life before Chaldea soon. It would eat at him for the longest time before it would explode, and nobody was wishing to be around for when he would eventually snap from all the pressure as well as criticism from everyone. That was when Mashu nodded, and Olga spoke up. Midoriya, don't think that I'm being too touchy here. But the whole reason that you were grabbed of the street was because we were one emissary short at Chaldea. If our last emissary who was on the list wasn't sick and could come in, you would have been continuing on with your life. But the only thing I have against you is the fact that you are a complete anomaly to magecraft as a whole. You have magic circuits, but you never use them. Surely you could have noticed them in the past. Olga questioned as Izuku glanced at her now. I never knew I even had magic circuits. I only found out when I went to that meeting at Chaldea, before the explosion took most of the MMSDRs out. Izuku said, rubbing his left arm. So you're telling me that you had a father who was a mage and he never told you about his magic circuits? Olga asked as Izuku looked at her funny. My father never told me about his life outside of our family. He only told me that he works in the United States, and even then he hasn't really talked to me and my Izuku said, feeling self-conscious about telling them about his life. So your father hid his life in the States from you and your mother. Has he even told you if he even gotten himself a new family? Olga asked, looking at the worst-case scenario. Like to not to think about that. He never told us what his life was like in the States. Izuku said, looking uncomfortable. After stating those words, the trio had just stayed quiet for a while with nobody wanting to continue the conversation at all. One could only hope that they could reveal some things that could give one another something to build off of in order to try and make a bridge between their conflicting personalities. That was until Izuku spoke. My life ever since I was announced quirkless it's just been utter hell. Izuku muttered. Nothing more needed to be stated. All that said was reason enough for one of the women to stare at him in sympathy. Although one of them was for completely different reasons for the other, as Mashu stared at Izuku in sympathy for being incapable of controlling whatever he was born with. Olga, however, stared at him in utter pity. She was born into a household that had incredible amounts of power, and the fact he was born into a family that was basically null compared to the rest of the world's population as well as mages in general, she wished he could have been born within her family. At least then he'd have far more confidence. 0W0, after a while of silence between the trio, Izuku let out a sigh before he stood up, stretching his limbs. Mashu did the same as Olga sat still thinking about what happened between the three of them, all as Siu was making his way back over to them where he could see them. He saw the looks on their faces. Izuku was grimmer than the girls, but the women were far more determined than the boy himself was. If anything, he looked far more uncomfortable than he'd been before. He let out a sigh of exasperation before he made sure to keep them on the task at hand, just to keep them distracted from whatever they had talked about, not that he didn't hear any of it. The group continued down the tunnel that they had been walking through until they reached an open area within it. It was massive in terms of height alone. It wasn't something that you'd find in any kind of mountain unless you went as deep as you could inside of it into your own demise. But that wasn't the problem right now. The problem was the fact that Berserker was standing right in front of everyone as he glared at each and every person with a hatred that Izuku couldn't guess. Siu also couldn't place the hatred in Berserker's eyes as the beast walked over to them with a glare of his own extending to that of Izuku. By the time he stood across from the small group of four, he glared at each and every person with a silent assessment of their character. Looking between each one, he found each one to have their own merits, but by the time he'd gotten to Izuku, the boy was staring at him with nothing more than fear alone. But that fear was overshadowing something that Berserker could see that really wanted to be let out, the urge to help him from whatever problem he had. Berserker moved slowly towards the group, Mashu entering a combat stance, but looking confused when he passed right by her. Each of them was greatly surprised to see Berserker kneeling in front of Izuku. Not in a way where he would be giving his allegiance to the boy, no, he knelt down as he began to pat the boy's head with nothing more than a grunt coming out of his mouth that was surprising for them all to see. Heracles, the Greek legend to have taken on multiple from the gods of Greece themselves, was kneeling to pat Izuku on the head as if that would calm down the boy's raging heart. That was all before the Greek legend pointed them in the direction they needed to go. How they knew that it was the correct way to go, you may ask. Well, the fact he kept grunting at them whilst pointing in that direction, of course. So as they moved in the direction, he pointed at Izuku, stared at Berserker with a curious glint in his eyes. He moved back to Berserker, who had been looking at the boy with a curious glint in his eyes as well. Even though they were enemies beforehand, the Berserker was holding himself back from attacking them again. Izuku held a hand out to Berserker as the man looked at the extended hand as the boy looked into Berserker's red eyes. Thank you for helping us move in the right direction, Izuku said, as Berserker moved his hand out. And in an act of camaraderie, they shook hands before Berserker flinched slightly and grabbed at his head. All before practically launching himself out of the cave they were in, forcing Izuku to run to catch up with the others as they moved through the tunnel again. And as they ran into the dark depths of the tunnel, we see Berserker launching himself as far into the sky as possible and essentially sending himself right into space. That way he will take way too long to return back to the battlefield. Because Heracles may have been an agent of the gods, but he listened to no man, especially one who titled themselves as a demonic god. With Izuku and the others, they had been trying to wrap their heads around the fact that Berserker showed a different side of himself towards Izuku. Olga and Mashu were very worried about Izuku's well-being. But that could be sorted somewhere else when they weren't running straight into a battlefield, as when they arrived within another cave, they found the Holy Grail floating in the air as it seemingly glowed ominously. As they moved to collect the Grail, that was when someone new showed up, and it wasn't another kind face. To think that Berserker could deny his MSDR's wishes. He was an utter fool. If he cannot defeat you all and end your journey here, then I will take it upon myself as the King of Knights to rid you all. The person called out, revealing Artoria but with a different look. The woman who had once had blue and silver armor and blonde hair now had a lighter-colored version of her blonde. Her eyes were golden in color, and her armor was black and red, the red being outlined across her body as though her mind and body weren't entirely there. Not to mention how the black seemingly seeped into her neck, causing her to look far more feral than most other servants, and Olga growled to herself in fury. Of course, the Holy Grail was being guarded by Saber, and of course, Saber had been completely taken over by madness enhancement but not enough to take away her coherence. Okay, we really need to talk about the luck we've been getting as of late. Olga yelled as Izuku stared at Saber. Her eyes belied that nothing behind them were her original self, but if anything this appeared to be a far different Saber. One who didn't care about her actions and dealt with the consequences on the go. This was Saber, but altered. This wouldn't be a good fight for them at all. See you, do you have something that could defeat Saber as fast as possible? Izuku asked, concerned. I mean, if I had a command seal powering me up I could use my noble phantasm, but that requires me to have the time and magical energy to use. Qiyu said as he pulled out his staff. Then use all the magical energy you can glean from me, and when I use the command seal, that is when you use your noble phantasm, all right? Izuku said, looking at Qiyu. What are you and the other two going to be doing? Qiyu asked as Izuku shrugged. We'll keep her off of you, Izuku said as Qiyu sighed. Just stay out of danger, she'll be gunning for you, Qiyu said with a teasing remark at the end. If you all are done strategizing right in front of me, then I will take the fight to you, Saber called out, rushing towards Izuku. If you will not come to me, then I will come to you, Saber called out as she rushed towards Izuku. The young man didn't allow her to land an attack on him as he leaped out of the way just in time as she slammed her sword into the ground. Izuku had leaped with Mash in his arms as they tumbled across the ground due to the blast radius of Saber's slam onto the ground. As the woman turned to look at Izuku with an expression ready for battle, he got right into his role as Emser and forgot about his whole grabbing onto Mash in order to get out of the way of an attack. Mash, you go at her from the front, we need to keep her distracted, Izuku called out, as Mash nodded and rushed the Saber. Yes, senpai, she called out, swinging her shield at Saber, who blocked the attack effortlessly. Izuku glanced over at Olga, who was looking at him with confusion before she noticed his gaze on her. Director-san, I need you to use whatever spells you can use at your disposal, Izuku said to her as Mash and Saber clashed once more. Who gave you the right to tell me what to do? She called out, angrily but following his directions. I need you to just not argue with me on this. Just use your magic to keep Saber on her toes. We cannot allow her to get close to see you, Izuku replied as he leaped out of the way from another slicing attack from Saber. Running around the cave, Izuku had dodged energy slices even though he thought he shouldn't have been capable of reacting to something like that. But he didn't take a gift horse in the face in how he was capable of that and decided to not worry about it at all, considering from what Saber looked like, she wasn't even trying at all against them. And as she leaped over at him, he had no chance of dodging out of the way of this next slicing attack as she appeared in front of him and rose her sword to slice in a downward horizontal strike. But just as Izuku was about to lean over to his left, Mash came in and blocked the strike and kicked Saber back, causing her to skid on her feet. And as she got her bearings back with a battle-ready smirk on her face, some gander shots smashed right into her back. She glanced over at Olga as the woman shrieked and went to move to a different angle to blast the Saber servant from afar, but was rushed by Saber, who was subsequently followed by Mash. Moving back over with Qiyu, Izuku watched as the servant had managed to get a quarter of his runes all set up for his noble phantasm, and everything was slowly moving right according to his plan. All that needed to happen was them tiring out Saber just enough to where she wouldn't be able to react to Seiyu's noble phantasm in time. But she then turned her attention to how Izuku was basically a sitting duck and immediately rushed him once again. Instinctively, Izuku raised an arm up into the air to block the attack, and everyone present were wearing faces of shock as the young man was being sliced with a very fatal attack from Saber. She wasn't playing around as she went to move her sword at him straight for his 𝗧𝗧 that he'd thrown his arms up to stop as though they could catch the very blade. But something odd happened. His arms glowed an ominous purple color as a giant shield projection had appeared to block the attack. It didn't block the entire attack, as it sent Izuku tumbling backwards as he smacked a nearby rock on his head, but it blocked him from being pierced. "Since when could you do that?" Olga screamed as she rushed over at Izuku. Mash had rushed over to Izuku's side as well as she checked up on him. And this gave Saber all the time she needed to catch her breath slightly before rushing at the women with their backs turned to her, a very rookie thing to do for both of them as Izuku's vision supplied him with Saber leaping at the two from behind. Standing upright immediately, Izuku pushed the two women out of the way, causing Saber to stare at him in surprise as the young man had taken the slice on his 𝗧𝗧, causing him to be blasted back from her power alone. Slamming into the wall behind himself, Izuku let out a cry of pain that was quickly muted by him biting 𝗧𝗪𝙢𝙢𝐼 on his hand. Looking at the uniform he'd been wearing, it had taken most of the attack that Saber had thrown at him and was basically turned to ribbons as it revealed his upper torso except for his arms. He wasn't thinking straight as he pulled himself out of the wall, as he ignored the sound of blood dripping from his very clear gash wound on his 𝗧𝗧 as he moved over to Mash and Olga, who were staring at him in clear confusion. "We need to move," he called out, dragging the two out of the way. "What the F what?" Olga cried out, as Mash got up and ran with Izuku. Saber watched the trio move to the other side of the cave with her back to Seiyu. She knew what he was trying to do, and she was allowing them this little farce, although she could feel Seiyu's glare centered on her back as she stood upright before looking over at Izuku intently. Seeing the boy's upper torso, she had been witness to seeing what amounted to years' worth of scars that could be only accrued through a tortuous lifestyle where he had to have been abused on a daily basis. Walking over, she stopped a few feet away as Izuku's body trembled in front of her. She could see he was clearly scared of her considering how his pupils have long since dilated. "Young man, what life have you lived to appear this way?" Saber asked, looking into his now shocked eyes. Izuku asked as Saber looked at him intently before walking closer. Mash immediately blocked her way to him as she felt a hand on her shoulder as Saber lifted her into the air and threw her over at Seiyu. The man barely could react as he was focused on the spell he was planning on using on Saber to end this whole thing right from the start. As Mash's voice rang out in pain, Izuku glared at Saber as the woman now stood above him, her height making him appear as though he were nothing more than a toddler walking around the park. "I will only say this again once. What life did you live to appear like this?" she asked, pointing at the obvious scarring around his torso aside from the gash wound on his 𝗧𝗧 from her. Why should I tell you?" Izuku questioned, very suspicious. "I only wish to know, because in my lifetime no child was harmed when under my rule," she stated as Izuku peered into her golden-colored eyes. "Life that was nothing compared to yours," Izuku said as Saber thought about her next words carefully. "Surely you jest. Tell me now, before I kill the woman next to you," Saber said, as Izuku glanced at the weapon pointed at Olga's neck. He remained silent as he watched Olga have a fearful expression as she nodded at him to tell the servant. He looked over at Mash and Seiyu as the two were looking at him in clear worry, and Mash was rushing over as fast as she could to try and attack Saber. Where superpowers were the normal. Where someone without power was treated as though we were less than trash itself. I was a second-class citizen in the eyes of others. A mere test subject for others to get stronger," Izuku said, before shuddering his last words out. "A punching bag." Saber stayed quiet, her eyes no longer being seen as her hair blocked his view of it. He glanced over at 𝗧𝗏 as the woman stared at him in shock but schooled her features since they would most definitely be talking about this later, if they do survive this moment in time. 𝗵𝘃𝗃 had stopped moving as she heard him practically scream these words out, causing her to immediately think about all his actions from before in Chaldea. The way he seemed especially scared of every single person within Chaldea, especially those who were very uncaring for their words about him when he was both around and not. Did anything bad happen to you before entering Chaldea? Saber questioned, sword trembling slightly. I asked my idol if my dream could be attained. Izuku said as Saber shuddered slightly. He denied your dreams, didn't he? Saber questioned but worded it as more of a statement. I have no power at least not of my own. He told me to be realistic, and to not pursue my dreams. Izuku said, before gaining a far more panicked expression looking at 𝗬𝗑. The man had finally finished his spell and was preparing to launch it over at Saber, and the servant herself was appearing as though she were preparing for it. So in a bid that confused him, 𝗧𝗏 and 𝗵𝘃𝗃, she grabbed Izuku and 𝗧𝗏 and tossed them over at 𝗵𝘃𝗃 as the young 𝗎𝗪𝙀 pseudo-servant had caught them in a panic. She rose her sword in the air as it glowed an ominous red and black color before 𝗵𝘃𝗃 stood in front of the duo with her shield blocking the way as a small holographic shield arose from the ground. Just as Saber was about to unleash her attack on the trio in order to end their lives, she hears the sounds of chanting. My magecraft is a cage of flames, a flaming but verdant giant. Retribution. A shrine that purifies the evil of human affairs. 𝗬𝗑 spoke, before rushing near Izuku, 𝗵𝘃𝗃 and 𝗧𝗏 and Four having manifested himself in the area. I'm proud you've held out for this long, even if it may not have been too long itself, he said, before rushing in front of the shield itself and raising his staff in the air shocking Saber. The one who destroys Wicker Man. He called out, stomping his staff on the ground. As soon as 𝗬𝗑 said those final words, a magic circle appeared underneath Saber who looked intrigued with the spell casted. All before a giant made of wood and metal appeared from the ground lifting her from it, and as the woman fell from its head and was caught in its hand. She tried to escape from its grip before it used its other hand to open up its 𝗧𝗑𝗃 and her inside closing the metallic gate behind her as it started to heat up. And as the giant head fell down towards the ground, Saber was seen falling down with it as she slammed into the metallic gate as the entire area was blocked by the magical flames from 𝗬𝗑's spell. A massive gust of wind pushed past everyone as 𝗵𝘃𝗃 and 𝗧𝗏 grunted, with Izuku managing to catch Four as it was tossed into the air. And pulling the animal to his 𝗧𝗑𝗃, he felt it start to lick at his still bleeding wound, before focusing his eyes on the attack in front of them all. The gusts of wind continued to blast past them all as 𝗬𝗑 watched the flames with a very cautious expression bordering on serious. The Wicker Man had then stood up encompassed by the flames as it broke through the cave that the fight was originally taking place inside, creating a giant pillar of flames to represent how much damage was done to the area. As soon as the smoke and debris soon cleared up, it revealed a very badly burned and defeated Saber, whose armor was slowly falling apart, but at the same time she herself was slowly disappearing from the world. She could only chuckle at the strength of this group of people before speaking to them. It's already over, the Grand Order has already begun, she said as 𝗬𝗑 glared at her. What are you talking about? What is this Grand Order? 𝗬𝗑 called out. I won't say, but just know this is just the beginning for you all, she said, before she turned into gold motes of light. Izuku mulled over her words as he noticed something happening to 𝗬𝗑 as well. The man was slowly disappearing in blue motes of light, and the man soon noticed it before he clicked his teeth in clear distaste for this kind of end. Ding, it appears that I'm dying as well. Well, it was fun whilst it lasted, but I guess I'll see you all later. 𝗬𝗑 questioned as Izuku stared at the man in shock. But before he could even get words out, 𝗬𝗑 had disappeared from sight. Izuku felt himself feel a bit bad for having 𝗬𝗑 use all of his magic as well as a command seal in order to seal the deal in taking down Saber, no pun intended. But as this was happening, they found that the Holy Grail for the 𝗵𝘃𝗃 singularity was just floating in the air where Saber had once been, and running towards it Izuku felt something was off. 𝗧𝗏 took note of Izuku's hesitance of moving towards the Holy Grail when they heard clapping coming from a nearby area, and looking over they found a man standing there, his eyes closed whilst a smile was shown on his face. Good job on taking care of Saber. I never thought you'd be capable of taking her on without a power of your own, but things just never stop entertaining me. The man said, as Izuku's expression became far more reserved and cautious with him. Leviticus. What are you doing here? I thought you were in the explosion back at Chaldea. Olga called out, relieved. Well, Director, you know me. I'm able to escape from any problem I see. The man, Lev stated with a very cruel smirk on his face. Thank goodness, we can now head back with the Holy Grail and begin to end these singularities. Olga stated, walking towards the man. Director-san. Izuku called out, placing a hand on her shoulder. What? She asked, completely confused as to why his face was showing vast amounts of concern. Don't trust him, Izuku said, with a very fearful expression on his face. Why shouldn't I trust him? He's the one who's been by my side through all of this. Olga said, as Izuku shook his head. He's not trustworthy. I don't know why, but I don't feel like he is someone you can trust. Izuku said, as Olga pulled her arm from Izuku's grip. I don't care what you say, Midoriya. I trust him with my life. Olga said, walking up to the man before giving him a hug. The man said nothing. But he gave Izuku a very sinister smile as he rose a hand and grabbed Olga by the shoulder. She looked up at the man with confusion before he used displacement magic on her, causing her to lose her gravity in the cave. Izuku went to rush over at the two before Mash grabbed him and held him still. Senpai, don't get any closer. It's too dangerous. Mash said, recognizing Lev as a major threat. Director-san. Izuku called out, reaching out to the woman as Mash held on to him. You know, Olga, I have to say you were a very vindictive but very bitchy boss. And I am so glad that I get to have this moment with you. Lev said as Olga stared at him in fear. Why are you doing this? I thought you worked with my father to complete this mission of his. She called out, as Lev smirked evilly with his eyes being revealed to be a rainbow of colors but sinister. That is why I killed him. He was too dangerous to be left alive. After all, I was the one who created this singularity in the first place. Lev said, before chuckling maniacally. Leave the director alone. Izuku screamed as Lev looked at him. And you, the so-called final emissary of Chaldea. My boss wanted to have you ignored, but I can see your threat level. If you are to stay alive, then you will be a thorn in our sides. So by causing this death, I will place you on a path towards joining us. After all, we both want humanity's destruction. Lev said before showing them Chaldea's. Izuku watched as Olga was lifted into the air and she was brought to Chaldea's core. Izuku struggled to break free from Mash's grip in order to stop this from happening, and as he struggled unaware to anyone watching this event, his arms began to glow a green color. Tiny, minuscule sparks of green electricity arced around his body as he somehow managed to form a bow for him to use, garnering the attention of Lev, who had looked over at him. His cruel smirk was increasing as Olga was brought over to Chaldea's through a portal and was nearing the core of it all, whose power was on par with that of a black hole itself. What's this? He questioned as Mash noticed Izuku having escaped from her grip. With a furious expression on his face, Izuku pulled the string on the bow as a green arrow with sparks of electricity had begun to spark all around his body as tears flowed from his eyes. All as he let out a massive scream of fury. Give her back! Izuku yelled as he released the arrow towards Leviticus. The man leaped away from his position as the arrow angles and flew towards Olga, just barely managing to grab her as she began to scream in pain. Just from her body touching Chaldea's was causing her to scream in ungodly amounts of agony before an arrow grabbed her clothing and yanked her away from Chaldea's immediately. But the damage was already too much before her body fell towards Izuku and Mash, the latter of which managed to catch her and look over her injuries as Izuku pulled back on his string again. And as soon as he released it with as much power as possible, Lev watched as the arrow flew towards him at an even higher speed than before, and it stopped right in front of his arm that rose up in defense. Just as he was about to gloat about how it was too weak, it began to twist in the air like a spiral before piercing through his arm, causing him to be greatly confused. All before detonating and leaving the area in a massive smoke cloud. Izuku, 𝗵𝗃, and Vour watched as the smoke was slowly clearing from their view. Izuku was far more winded from using such an attack as he heavily, not to mention the BLD loss was starting to affect him much more than he thought. He was feeling his vision slowly fading, but he forced himself to see this through, but all in all he was feeling like he did something useful. Once the smoke and dust cleared up, it revealed 𝗧𝗵 standing there with a morbidly confused expression on his face, as though he felt massive amounts of pain coursing through his veins but wasn't showing anything painful outside. The man glared over at Izuku before he turned around, walking away from view as he took the Holy Grail with him, disappearing from sight and allowing the trio to immediately set their sights on getting Olga the medical attention the woman required. Grabbing the woman and placing her on his back, Izuku tried to forget the feeling that not having her breath on his neck was very, very bad in terms of her health, since that meant she wasn't breathing. But with the whole cave beginning to show signs that it was collapsing, they needed to leave the place before anything bad happened. So as he, 𝗵𝗃, and Vour rushed through the tunnel they had originally entered from, they moved through the tunnel systems until they found an opening in the roof, supposedly where Heracles had originally busted through, and continued running down the tunnel's halls. They failed in their mission to get the Holy Grail, but that didn't mean that their overall mission in order to save humanity was over, but something was nagging the back of Izuku's mind. The fact that 𝗧𝗵 was clearly against Olga, and from the aura the man was showing, it caused him to feel as though he were an ant in front of the man in terms of magical prowess. Pushing that thought to the back of his mind, he and 𝗵𝗃 arrived outside of the tunnel leading to Mt. Enzo. Looking at their timer, they found that Romani had been trying to get into contact with them the entire time and was only able to get through due to whatever was happening at the moment. Thank goodness I've been calling you all for about 15 minutes. The singularity is falling apart. You need to return back to Chaldea. Romani called out, as Izuku gave the man a nod. Once the ray-shifting process was beginning, Izuku took the time to look around the place before noticing something shining in the distance. Using his eyes to try and see it clearly, he found that it was either the sun or a glint of something glass-like shining through the sun's presence behind it. But before he and 𝗵𝗃 could be ray-shifted, he felt something pierce through his 𝗧𝗍 right where his gash was located, as he let out a cry of pain, garnering the attention of 𝗵𝗃. "Senpai," she called out before the two and Olga were ray-shifted back to Chaldea. As they traveled through the ray-shift, Izuku felt himself slowly losing consciousness. And once he'd made it through with Olga's body on his back, he fell through the shell of the ray-shifting device as his face showed nothing more than a tired expression on his face. Romani and the others rushed him over to the medical bay with Olga as they all tried to make heads or tails with whatever in the hell just happened, not to mention with the clear confusion of 𝗧𝗵 betraying them all like this. And with 𝗵𝗃 feeling extra bad for not being able to protect Izuku from being harmed at all, she was a pseudo-servant. She had the speed and reaction time of that of a servant. How could she fail her senpai like this? As the young girl beat herself up inside, Romani tended to Izuku and Olga, but from what it appeared Olga wouldn't be surviving the night. And with that, he and 𝗵𝗃 had set up a funeral to be set up and prepared for the woman, as she would be sent into Chaldea's core so that she could be one with her father's project. It was what they did with Mr. Marisberry himself when he was found dead in his office, when they found out he was either killed or killed himself through a suicide. And as Izuku recovered, Romani took over looking over the young man's scarring and tried his best to make sure that Izuku's body wouldn't accrue any more scars. He looked at 𝗵𝗃 days after they had sent Olga's body into Chaldea's, as the two decided to try and upgrade any of the uniform to hold a mystic code that Izuku could utilize in battle, as it was very clear that he'd need something to assist him when he gets separated, not to mention what in the hell he summoned when in the singularity itself. The fact he created a bow and was able to use it perfectly without any kind of practice was concerning. So the two set out to make as much of the mystic code for Izuku to wear on their missions within the future when they find the next singularity. "Is senpai going to be alright?" 𝗵𝗃 asked Romani as the man looked at her. "I'm going to do everything in my power to prevent him from dying," he said, as 𝗵𝗃 nodded before looking at the bed where Izuku lay. It's been about 2 days since the boy had been resting there. How much magical energy did he use in order to construct a bow and use magical arrows? 𝗵𝗃 asked, curiously. "I don't think it's a quirk. If it was, it chose one hell of a time to manifest itself." Romani said as he looked over Izuku's medical files as well as what he got from the boy's blood work and x-rays. So he doesn't have a quirk? Mash asked, confused. Yes, that much I'm aware of. But from what I am seeing here, there's like a secondary set of a nervous system similar to our magical circuits within his body. It's as though it's combined itself with his central nervous system and dulled his senses when it comes to pain. I'm not sure if that's a safe thing to happen, but from what I'm seeing, his body will continuously get stronger the more he fights. And there's a severe lack of magical energy within him at the moment. Romani said as Mash nodded. Do you think he used up all his energy in creating his bow and allowing 𝗬𝗪𝗀𝗏 to use his noble phantasm? 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗏 questioned. That shouldn't be feasibly possible for it to happen. Because using a command spell gives the servant more than enough power to be capable of using their full power and then some. Romani said, whilst rubbing his chin. Mash decided to leave the room so that Izuku could have some rest without bothering him. Although he probably would tell her that he didn't mind her presence if he was awake, she just wanted to be alone in the moment since she'd nearly watched him die. And with Romani and 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗏 in the same room as Izuku, they never noticed how his body slightly twitched before his body sat upright almost as though it were on autopilot. With him opening his eyes drearily and taking in the room before noticing Romani and 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗏 sitting in front of a computer with clear confusion writ on their faces. He softly placed his feet on the ground before moving over to look over their shoulder as he looked at whatever they were staring at. And from what he could see, it was an X-ray of his nervous system throughout his body, and he could see some green lights moving along it as though it were a secondary skin over the nervous system itself. Tilting his head slightly, he spoke to Romani and 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗏 as though he'd been awake for the last 2 days. So, is this something new with me? Izuku asked, as Romani retorted. Pretty much, not that we know much about it. It's completely different from any other kind of magical circuits we've seen before. Romani stated as 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗏 looked back at Izuku. Well, nice to see you awake, kid, but why aren't you resting right now? She asked with a small smile. I just wanted to make sure that Director-san was still doing fine. I'm pretty sure that we managed to get her out of the singularity. Izuku said, without stuttering even once. Kid, you've been asleep for 2 whole days. She didn't survive the night when you brought her back from the Fuyuki singularity. Romani said with a sad expression. Oh, well, I guess I should head to my room to rest. Izuku said as he walked out of the room. Moving through the halls, he found himself becoming slightly cold due to him only wearing bandages over his injuries. He was both mentally exhausted, emotionally exhausted, and for one thing he really hoped that what he was hearing coming up to him from behind wasn't one of those pompous mages who really hated him. Looking over his shoulder, he found it was indeed one of the pompous mages who clearly had a problem with him. What do you want? Izuku asked, cursing himself internally for stuttering. Geez, what is up with the stutter? I thought you would have gotten over it by now. The mage growled out. I'm sorry, but I only been here for about 4 days total. Losing my stutter isn't really easy to do. Izuku said, trying to leave. But each time the mage blocked his way, causing him to give them an empty look. Look, what you did back there was surprising. But don't let this get to your head. Once the other mages are healed up and back to full health, you better make sure to make yourself scarce. Because the real heroes of the world are them, not you. The mage stated with a finger pushing Izuku back slightly. If you had that much of an issue with me, why don't you take the title of humanity's last and... Izuku questioned as the mage glared at him. If I could, I would. The mage said as Izuku stared at him with disgust. You're no better than those who tortured me back home. Izuku muttered as he walked away. Leaving the mage alone in the hallway, Izuku felt his heart rate spike up as he stumbled about the place. Once he found the room that belonged to him, he stumbled over to it and climbed onto it before pulling the bed coverings over himself as he shivered slightly from how cold they were. But once he found a good spot to fall asleep, he felt his eyelids become so heavy that he passed out instantly without any kind of trouble. 0W0? For the next couple of days, Izuku would spend that time training himself on using a bow and arrow. From what he'd seen against Lev, the arrow he'd used against the man wasn't nearly enough to take the man down and defeat him, stopping him from whatever plans he had for the singularity in Fuyuki. He used the simulation room so that he could train himself to his heart's content, not wanting to be the one who has to rely on 𝗵𝗃 every time he's with her on these little adventures. But since he was using a 𝗧𝗵𝗲, he tried to summon his 𝗧𝗵𝗲 again only for it to fail, something about him not having enough energy to make it. That was when 𝗵𝗃 came into the room with a smile on her face. She rushed over to him and pulled him into a hug as he felt his face erupt into a massive blush as he froze in place, not even sure of what he should do in the moment. As for everything that he could feel, two somewhat large pillows were pushing onto his pectorals, and thick thighs were just barely grazing his own thighs. What is going on right now? Izuku thought to himself. I'm so glad that you're safe, senpai. I thought that you were going to die, she said as she held him close to herself. Izuku felt completely confused from this kind of interaction with 𝗵𝗃. She hadn't shown this kind of care for him ever since he first arrived at Chaldea when he was practically kidnapped. She just accepted his existence here. Not to say that he was clearly incapable of even seeing that the care being given to him for the first time ever by anyone aside from his own mother was something he deserved. He'd lived a life where nobody aside from his mother stated that his life even had meaning without a power of his own, and now that this was happening, he couldn't help but think that this was only happening because he had a power. He didn't voice this thought as he really didn't wish to express that kind of thought to 𝗵𝗃 at this point in time. She was going through a moment where she thought he was going to die and had left before he'd woken up and went to bed the previous day. So with very twitching arms, he wrapped them around 𝗵𝗃, who immediately tightened the hug on him as his face slowly erupted in an extremely massive blush from being so close to a girl. Once she pulled away, 𝗵𝗃 didn't question him why his heartbeat was more than it was when he was training, but just stood off to the side as she watched him attempt to recreate the 𝗧𝗵𝗲 he'd made in the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁 singularity. Through a lot of trial and error, Izuku imagined the situation again between Lev and Olga that caused him to summon the 𝗧𝗲. And once he reimagined the moment between Olga and Lev within his mind, his arms glowed with green circuits that sparked electricity around his body. It then flowed into his hands as a green energy moved up and down in front of him, creating a new 𝗧𝗲 in his hands. It was an appealing 𝗧𝗲 to see as it featured a small galaxy as its appearance. The string was a long line that had small planets that represented the galaxy they all lived within. Looking down at the 𝗧𝗲 in his hands, Izuku kept his hands on it as he felt the power coming from it. It wasn't much more powerful than the one he'd created in the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁 singularity, but to say that it wouldn't assist him on his adventures through time and space would be an understatement. Looking over at 𝗵𝗃, the girl smiled at him happily as Izuku rose the 𝗧𝗲 as he channeled his magecraft into making the arrow, as even more sparks of green electricity had sparked around the weapon this time. And within seconds a small arrow glowing with green energy and small sparks of green electricity had formed on the line connected between Izuku's index and middle fingers. 𝗵𝗃, can you please have the simulation make a stationary servant from the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁 singularity appear in front of me? I'd like to see how much damage I'd do to a servant with this, Izuku asked as 𝗵𝗃 nodded. As she walked to the control room to set up the whole simulation, Izuku watched as the area around himself was changed from a training area. It soon was filled with fires around the entire city of 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗁, and standing in front of him was 𝗧𝗪𝗪𝗂, one of the more powerful servants of the Berserker class of servants. He stood still as he snarled at Izuku with nothing more than stationary hatred as Izuku took in a deep breath, and as he slowly let go of the arrow, he and 𝗵𝗃 watched as the arrow flew towards 𝗧𝗪𝗪𝗂. It flew through the air as though it were cutting wind itself, all before reaching 𝗧𝗪𝗪𝗂 and stabbing right at his 𝗧𝗑, which had some difficulty reaching through his tough hide. But it began to twist in a horizontal spiraling circle as energy flashed all around it. All before it punctured through the tough hide on 𝗧𝗪𝗪𝗂's skin, all before it detonated with a massive explosion that covered the entire room in a purple and green dust. Coughing slightly from some going into his nose without even realizing it, Izuku moved away and waved the dust away as 𝗵𝗃 used her shield in order to send the dust away and reveal what happened to 𝗧𝗪𝗪𝗂. The Berserker was still standing still as he glared at Izuku with all the hatred that a Berserker would project towards an enemy. Walking over to the 𝗧𝗪𝗪𝗂, Izuku looked over the spot where he'd shot 𝗧𝗪𝗪𝗂 in the 𝗧𝗑. There didn't appear to be any outward damage to Heracles as he placed a hand over his chin in thought as he looked as close as he could to see what had happened or if there would be any more signs of damage. Even if it was minuscule, it would allow Izuku to know that his arrows could damage heroic spirits if their guard was lowered enough for him to actually surprise them with that kind of attack. When used against another mage like Lev, it was clear that he wasn't strong enough to hurt another higher-level mage when it came to magecraft itself. So as he glared at the spot where he shot Heracles in the city, he found just the tiniest of scars on it. And that was when Izuku realized something. He'd actually shot where Heracles' heart would have been located, and there was a tiny scar where it had apparently pierced through Heracles' tough skin. He glanced back over at Mash as she brought over a magnifying glass as the two stared at the very minuscule-looking scar on the simulated Heracles' skin before looking at one another in clear confusion. Senpai, how much E-energy do you place in your arrows? Mash asked, bewilderment clear on her features. I don't know. He never used magecraft until now. Izuku said, looking at his hands. We need Romani to be here to test the amount of magecraft you're using for one of these arrows. Mash said, rushing out of the room to search for Romani. Izuku went into the control room of the simulation area before turning off the Heracles simulation. Sighing in slight relief, he couldn't help but feel a great well of fear that came with the giant of a man glaring at him with hate in his eyes. Shivering from the memory of Heracles glaring at him in the simulation room, Izuku moved over towards the cafeteria in order to see if he could make something for him to eat. It wouldn't be much, but it'd be hopefully enough for him to re-energize himself so that he could do some more tests with his magecraft arrows. But that provided him with a question. What would he call the bow and powerful arrows? Should I call them Archer's Fury? No, that wouldn't do. He'd be making fun of archers around history. Izuku mumbled as he cooked. He was so focused on what to name his bow and magic arrows that he never heard Romani and 𝗵𝗃 entering the cafeteria in search of him, only to find him muttering to himself about potential names for his new magecraft ability. Hey Izuku, mind coming to the simulation room to test out how much magecraft energy you're using later? Romani asked, as Izuku nodded. Yeah, just need to figure out what I'm going to name the attack, Izuku said, as he sat down with some eggs and bacon. Alright, just come to the simulation room when you have the time, Romani said, as Izuku nodded. Hours later, Izuku found himself inside the simulation room with Romani, 𝗵𝗃 and Mash watching from the control room. Izuku was standing in the middle of the room as Romani set up the simulation to have him facing off against a certain unmoving object just to see how much damage he could do to inanimate objects. When they watched as Izuku summoned his bow, this time with far more success than before, Izuku summoned the arrow to be used in such an attack. As soon as the arrow was in the process of being summoned, Romani began to calculate the amount of energy being used in its creation. As they recorded the amount of power being packed into the arrow, Romani's eyes slowly widened as he watched the arrow glow. Looking over at Chaldea's calculations of the power in the attack, it was clearly powerful, but for some reason it wasn't showing that it was powerful enough to even damage other mages. It was as though Izuku himself was a long-lost descendant of a heroic spirit who had managed to take their magic and be far more capable of using it at its full power to be used against heroic spirits themselves. If it wouldn't do much, it could do a potentially fatal attack to those who had lowered their guards enough to where the arrow could pierce through whatever defenses they have and detonate. And when they all watched as the arrow was shot, it was so fast it was as fast as Saber Alter from the 𝗵𝗃 singularity. The sheer speed of it made Romani's eyes bulge out of his head as he watched as it pierced through the metallic box that was being used as a test subject before causing it to explode from the inside out. There was no recorded heroic spirit that could have their arrows or weapons detonate within their enemies before in history, much less in the future. So this had to be a mix of someone else's magecraft and one who could protect the user from kill shots. Izuku, what was your father's job? Romani asked through the intercom. My dad worked in the States, but he never spoke about what kind of job he worked under, Izuku said as Romani thought about it. There could be a possibility that your father was a mage. What about your mother? Romani questioned as Izuku shook his head. My mother was a stay-at-home mother. But even then, she worked at the local hospital from time to time as a nurse, Izuku said as Romani thought about it. If his mother and father had vastly different jobs, then the fact that you have a magecraft energy signature of a servant who had been alive at some point, that means that he's the byproduct between a servant and human SXL relations. Romani stated with clear confusion. So what you're saying is that senpai isn't even fully human? Mash asked, as Romani thought about answering that question. Well, it's either that or his magical reserves are so great that he physically can't show exhaustion unless he'd been damaged too much. Romani said as everyone stayed quiet. Romani, I have a problem. Izuku spoke as Romani turned around and looked through the window. Everyone stared at Izuku in clear confusion as they saw his state of undress. His uniform had utterly been shredded, but was replaced with a new set of garments that made him appear more as a badass in Romani's perspective. The boy had a sash on his hip that fluttered around him softly. His boots that were once red in color were black and extended up to his lower calf muscle. His upper 𝗧𝗵𝗃 and torso was covered with a small amount of armor but revealed his abdominal section and revealed a bunch of burn scars, all as they looked at his arms, which were covered by red fabric that covered them with a soft cloth. Then sitting over his eyes were blue goggles that had a clear lens that showed his very confused eyes as he looked at them all with clear confusion. Apparently, when Izuku used his magecraft in a different way, it allowed him to be wearing battle-ready attire. The final nail in the coffin that he wasn't completely human was the fluffy tail coming out from behind him with the ears on top of his head. Please tell me that this is normal. Izuku called out, his eyes becoming swirls. That's the thing, Izuku, I don't know if that is. Romani stated as Izuku suddenly passed out. Izuku woke up a few hours later. He didn't know what he was supposed to feel at the moment. He had no powers entering Chaldea, even if it was against his will, and then all of a sudden, he gets all these different powers. It was too much for his mind to handle when he gave himself that new outfit as well as features. Now though he stood in front of the mirror that was in his bedroom. He stared at his features. They were still plain looking from what he could remember, but his canine teeth had gotten far larger than they were beforehand. Not to mention that his new appendages really wanted to have him explore them more, as his tail constantly kept on flicking itself around, clearly showing his emotions at the moment. Not to forget about his new ears that replaced the old ones which had gone under his skin now. Since his whole transformation into that new battle form, sue him, he won't care. But the fact that ever since he activated that battle attire form, he just couldn't understand why it activated this kind of ability within his body as though it was there from the beginning. And from how the others reacted to him in that form, they had no clue as to who he was the descendant or reincarnation of, since there were a lot of servants in mythological lore that had the same appearance as his ears and tail. But they had very few myths where they could use a magic arrow and create a bow from literally nothing. Wanting to just take a break from training at the moment, he walked over to 𝗵𝗃𝗃's workshop as he found the woman holding a small bag. Looking at it confusedly, he glanced over at the woman who was overlooking Mash's shield as she drew a summoning circle on it. Glancing over at him with her eyes, the woman had smiled at him before walking over to him. Hey 𝗧𝗵𝗲. I knew that you'd be awake soon, but now you need to summon a servant to assist us in our fight against our foes who are trying to cause the incineration of humanity. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said, with a smile on her face. Okay, but what am I supposed to do? Izuku asked as he watched 𝗵𝗃𝗃 place the shield on a platform. You are to use these quartz crystals in order to summon heroic spirits from the past. They will work for you as well as help you on your journey to save the world. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said, as Izuku gave her a worried expression. I would technically be enslaving them, wouldn't I? Izuku asked, as 𝗵𝗃𝗃 nodded sadly. Yeah, but there's nothing that we can do. Heroic spirits are summoned so that you can collect a holy grail. Depending on the passion you put into your speech, any heroic spirit from the singularity that you and Mash just returned from can be summoned. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said, as Izuku nodded nervously. Moving closer to the shield, Mash had entered the room as Izuku stood before the shield himself. Placing the quartz crystals on the table, he watched as the shield began to glow a blue and golden light before he took a deep breath in through his nose as he spoke out loud, albeit with some stuttering. It would be a long while before he'd get rid of it. Of course, 𝗵𝗃𝗃 gave him a piece of paper that he held and read word for word whilst speaking it out loud. I hereby propose thou shalt come under my command, and thy sword shall become my fate. Abiding by the summons of the Holy Grail, if thou dost accede to this will and reason, answer me. I hereby swear. I am all that is good in the eternal world. I am the disposer of evil in the eternal world. Thou, clad with the great Trinity, come forth from the circle of constraint. Izuku spoke as his voice seemingly vibrated through his stutters before pricking his hand, allowing BLD to fall from it. It landed on the shield as the circle began to glow ominously in a very crimson-red color. And as it span in the air, Izuku finished the incantation in order to summon the servant from the 𝗵𝗃𝗃 singularity. Guardian of the heavens. Izuku yelled out. What no one in the room could even prepare for was as soon as the red glow encompassed the room. Another part of the building blew up comedically, causing everyone to look in that direction from the doorway, but as for Izuku, he remained standing in front of the table. As the glow of red light encompassed the room, it died down soon enough, revealing a man with red clothing with some small amount of armor plating around his upper 𝗧𝗍 and to the left arm. His hair was white, with his eyes being a very dark gray in color, and his hair was swept back but kept a small amount of its spiky appearance. He stood on the table as he looked at each and every member of Chaldea who resided within the room itself, all before looking down to Izuku as he stepped down from the table itself before taking in the young man's appearance. Once he was finished with that, he looked into Izuku's eyes as he towered over the boy. With Izuku being only around 5 feet 4 inches in height due to his life before coming to Chaldea, he was very intimidated by the vastly taller man who deeply stared into Izuku's eyes. Servant Archer, at your service. Is there anything you need of me? The man asked, as Izuku stared at him for a moment longer. You do whatever why you want. Izuku said in a questioning way. Well then, I might as well try and turn this place into something befitting of its status amongst mages. The man said before walking through the door. I thought he was gonna kill me. Izuku said, holding his 𝗧𝗧 as strong as he could. Mash could only rub his back as she helped him by just being there to prevent a panic attack. 0W0. A few minutes after Izuku calmed down from his high of actually meeting a heroic spirit who wasn't going to kill him on sight, he moved through the halls as he made his way into the cafeteria, and by the time he entered the place, he soon found that a lot of the Chaldea staff were in there as well. They had created their own cliques as they spoke to one another without making much sound that he could hear with his new appendages. But he could vaguely hear what they were saying, although it was in pieces. He knew that they all didn't really like him, especially with him coming out of nowhere and actually becoming the final emissary of Chaldea. Sighing in exasperation at how most of the Chaldea staff were just being complete PP, Izuku sat down at his own table. He didn't do much aside from pulling out a notebook and writing down everything he could on the heroic spirit he had just summoned. He had done a few summonings in the last few days since he'd returned from the 𝗵𝗃𝗃 singularity, but he'd strayed as far away from those servants as possible. He wasn't afraid of them, really. He just didn't think they'd really like him as a person considering his very meek nature. He had been told many times in the past that nobody likes a meek personality, but from what he saw they really couldn't care less about it. It was just the life he'd lived talking to him, giving him voices in the deepest depths of his mind, trying to trick him into thinking that, and the sad part of that was it was definitely working. He kept hearing those voices talking to him every moment of every day, Kaken telling him that being in a place like this didn't mean he could become a hero. How All Might said those words to him on that rooftop, causing him to shake his head. Looking down at his notebook, he found that he'd just written everything he could find on the heroic spirit he'd summoned. The man wasn't much of a heroic spirit compared to the others, aside from his dreams of becoming a hero of justice, but had his viewpoints skewed because of what his life became after being transformed into a counter-guardian. He began to draw the heroic spirit that he'd summoned, trying his very best to get everything about the man correct based on his appearance. Izuku was so focused on making the drawing of the heroic spirit as close as possible to the person, that he never noticed how one of the staff, one of the mages specifically, had moved towards him. Izuku was in the middle of drawing Archer when he felt a presence behind him, not to mention hearing them walking towards him. As he turned his gaze over his shoulder, he found that the mage from the other day had come over to him again. But this time he'd reached over Izuku entirely and grabbed his notebook, immediately causing Izuku to stare at him in confusion before looking at the table and seeing that his notebook was gone. Standing up, he reached for the notebook as the mage lifted it even higher into the air. You really need to stop acting like you're all high and mighty. This isn't a place for you. You should be training yourself to be a better 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏. The man said, as Izuku continued to reach for the notebook. Give it back. Izuku said, as he tried to jump and grab it this time. I'm not giving it back until I see what you've been drawing in here. Clearly it's important if you want it back. The mage said, before opening the notebook itself. As the mage was reading his notes on the spirits that he'd summoned, Izuku tried again to grab the notebook once more. Only for the mage to move out of the way, causing him to smash his forehead onto the corner of a table nearby as he laughed at Izuku. Ha, really? You're taking notes on your heroic spirits that you've summoned. You should know their information by now. Are you really a true mage? The man said, pulling a red crystal out of his pocket. Izuku's vision flashed to when he was in his classroom 2 weeks ago at the end of class. The boy holding his notebook up in the air before blowing it up, all before tossing it out the window and into a koi pond. All before he was told to kill himself and collect said notebook out of the koi pond at the bottom of the building. As the mage went to activate the crystal, he never noticed how Izuku's ears had flicked back and leant backwards as his tail flicked side to side in a very clearly angered way. Unaware to Izuku, however, the fangs in his mouth had grown just a bit longer as his eyes changed from their green color to a muddy black. I said give it back. Izuku growled out, before the mage looked down at him. The boy's hair and flicked back ears were very clearly covering his eyes. And his tail was flicking back and forth very angrily as he slowly lifted his head to glare at the mage himself with a very toothy scowl on his face. And what are you gonna do? Bite me? The mage said, before activating his fire crystal, burning the notebook entirely. Two things happened very fast in the room. One was the mage looking into Izuku's very clearly angered eyes. And two, a person appeared behind the mage who held his arm up high in the air as the mage himself looked over his shoulder to find the most recent heroic spirit that Izuku summoned standing there. Are you really going to talk like that to my 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏? Who cares if he takes notes on us heroic spirits? That a much better job of gathering intel than you were doing. Not to mention, if you actually paid more attention to my 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏, you would have noticed that he was on the cusp of a panic attack from you bullying him. The archer servant said, before tossing the mage across the room. Izuku looked down at the ashes on the ground as he tried to piece them back together. The boy's facial features weren't shown too much, but he was very clearly distraught if a mere notebook could get him this quiet. So being the servant that he was, he assisted Izuku in collecting all the ashes of the notebook before Izuku looked him in the eyes. The boy's muddy black eyes were off-putting a bit before Archer had placed a palm on the boy's back, rubbing it softly. The muddy black eyes changed back to their green as tears began to come out in full as Izuku lowered his head slightly. All before he got up and walked away with a slumped expression as Archer looked at the nearby staff members of Chaldea. Even in this place, bullying still takes place. 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 really needs to grow a backbone. Archer thought before following the boy. Moving through the halls, Archer soon found Izuku standing in his bedroom as he stared at his own image. The reflection of himself in the mirror was confusing as the boy hadn't really been shown as wanting to look at himself all that much. That was before the boy had begun to change his clothing. Archer entered his astral form and entered the room itself as he watched his 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 change his clothes. Call him a creep, but he had a bad feeling about the boy from the moment he first met him. And then he saw them, the scars all over the boy's back, legs, arms. How the boy even used some rags to pull away what appeared to be makeup that showed burn marks on his face. The boy's ears flicked a little bit as though he were trying to listen to something or someone. That was until they went back to normal and Izuku moved to sit down on his bed. He wrung his wrists as he had his hands trace over cut scars as well as burn marks that were very clearly years old. That was when Archer decided to make himself known as he appeared in the room itself as Izuku glanced up at him, his green eyes showing that he was not surprised to see him. The boy pulled his legs to his 𝗧𝗍 as he wrapped them with his arms before looking at the wall. Nothing was stated for a small bit. That was before Archer spoke. How did you get them? He asked, sitting next to Izuku. Where do you think? Izuku asked back. Don't patronize me, kid. I'm older than you, and if you are to act like that in front of the others, then they will begin to take advantage of your patience. Archer spoke. Have you ever had a dream you wanted to achieve your entire life? Only for someone, no everyone, to just beat you down for it? Izuku asked, as Archer didn't look at Izuku. I've had a dream where I wanted to become something idealistic. But I changed my viewpoint on it since then. Archer said, as Izuku scoffed. Why you achieved that dream? I can't. Izuku said, squeezing his legs tighter. Who said I ever achieved my dream? Archer said, before glancing at Izuku. You became a hero. Why you lived saving lives I was powerless, and after this I won't be capable of becoming a hero. Izuku said as Archer's face grimaced. You want to be a hero? What makes you think that I wanted to become a hero myself? Archer questioned. I read your history. Izuku said, looking at the nearby computer. What did you find out about it? He asked softly. Just that you wanted to become a hero of justice. As similar to my dream, but vastly different at the same time. Izuku muttered. And I know you want to become a hero yourself. But what kind of hero are you wishing to become? Archer questioned. He was testing the kid's resolve to become a hero. If he failed, he would just unsummon himself and return to the Grail. But if he passed the test, then he'd help nurture the skills he already has to become one of the best heroes the world has ever seen. I want to become a symbol. Something that can tell others, who don't have power of their own, that they can shoot for the stars. That it is possible to become a quirkless hero. Izuku said as Archer looked at him. But no matter how strong I tried to achieve that dream, nobody would allow me the chance. Izuku said as he looked at a nearby camera in the room. Did you give up? He asked as Izuku shook his head. And not exactly. I was close to doing so when I was walking home, to the saying, never meet your heroes. Izuku asked Archer, who nodded. Why yeah, well I kind of met my idol/hero. Izuku said as he shuddered. Wasn't who you thought he was, wasn't he? Archer questioned. He was just human, a man hiding behind an image. In my time, everyone looks at heroes like they're gods. That was how the media portrayed them, paragons of good that can never be taken down. Izuku said as Archer growled at that. So the heroes of your time are parading around as though they were real heroes? He asked. You need a license to even be a hero. Izuku said, as Archer growled louder this time. You need a license to even save people in your time. He questioned angrily. Why yeah, and as a hero most don't even look at the job like that. They see it as a way to gain followers, gain people who actually believe in them. It's no more a play than it is actually saving people. Izuku said as he looked at the ground in dismay. Well then, how about we show them that you can become a hero without those pesky powers that they call quirks? Archer asked as Izuku pointed at his head. I can't achieve the quirkless hero dream of mine. I need to not have a quirk for that. Izuku said, before continuing. And not to mention the HPSC really hates quirkless people. They wouldn't even allow me to have a license to save people. Izuku said as he sighed. So then, prove it to them that you could become a hero without a quirk. Don't use those appendages on your body, act as though they are nothing but a burden on your body. Archer said, as Izuku sighed. Are you trying to inspire me again? Izuku asked, looking at Archer. I've made my decision to show you everything I know so that you can become an even better hero than all of them. Archer said as Izuku looked at him. Why? Izuku asked, as Archer glanced at Izuku's very confused expression. Because I feel like it, I don't care that you used to be quirkless. All heroes before your time had been quirkless. Archer said, as Izuku sighed again. They at least had a power they cultivated in order to reach that status. King Arthur had Excalibur, Gilgamesh had his godly status, Heracles was born literally half god, Medusa was actually the monster that fought Odysseus. I have no kind of power that would allow me to become similar to them in legends. Izuku said as Archer glared at Izuku. What's with this defeatist attitude? I thought you wanted to become a symbol of determination to help others like you. Archer growled at Izuku. Maybe because of the fact that the world doesn't care if I want to become a hero. Maybe it's because by all rights, I should be a god-demon villain. Izuku yelled. That all came out of his mouth before Archer slapped him in the cheek. The young man just looked even more miserable at this point as he slumped as his ears slumped against his head and his tail curled up even more around himself. Archer then chose that moment to speak. Never, and I mean never, ever say that about yourself again. Your life may be far worse than those around you, you have the scars to prove it. But that doesn't mean that you should give up on a dream that you worked strong for years to try and obtain. If you want to become a hero, then do it for the sake of others, not because your ego is so fragile that you can't handle the real world. Archer said as Izuku spoke again. I'm sorry. I know what I said was wrong, but W is what I said not true. Izuku asked as Archer looked at Izuku from the doorway. By your words, you should have become a villain that created a legend for yourself. But at the same time, you would have been a hero to those who understood your plight. So in a way, you would have been the hero of your own story, whilst you were the villain of another person's story. You aren't a hero due to your deeds, but by the actions and people you meet along the way who are inspired by your actions. A hero isn't someone who can run around with a suit and jacket saving lives. They are made from the actions they took to keep those around them safe from any and all harm. Even that idol of yours would be the pinnacle of heroism, even if he admonished your dreams. Archer said before leaving the room. Izuku had never felt worse for yelling at a servant, but at the same time he felt like he got something off his chest, something that was deeply hidden within his mind that needed to be stated, even if it was to someone who was technically dead. Sighing, Izuku pulled the covers over himself as a few tears fell from his eyes as he fell asleep, and outside the door Archer stood with his arms crossed. And walking over to the door was Mash as the young girl looked at Archer with confusion. Archer, what are you doing here? Mash asked. Just had a talk with the 𝗵𝗃. He needs to be alone at this point in time. He had a lot on his tea that he wanted said and he got them out to me. Come on, I'll make some dinner for you to take to him later. Archer said as Mash nodded. Okay Archer-san, what did you both talk about anyway? Mash asked curiously. Nothing you should worry about right now. Archer stated as he continued down the hall. I can never get a read on that guy, she said as she followed him. Walking through the halls of Chaldea, Izuku found himself wondering about what his life was going to be like now. He couldn't return back to the life he originally had now that he knew about the world of mages and heroic spirits. For him, becoming similar to them was actually slowly becoming similar to a hero in his eyes, as he could summon heroic spirits from many different points in time and actually meet them in person. Although he was confused with the heroic spirit 𝗵𝗃𝗲, considering the man was a counter-guardian who summoned himself in place of another servant at one point in time of the past. Taking a deep breath, Izuku found himself stopping in front of 𝗵𝗃𝗃's office as he found the woman clearly at work. Entering her workshop, he moved closer to her as the woman was strong at work on making a new set of uniform for him to use in their next jump into the singularity that will be found soon. Romani had stated that he was just having trouble pinpointing its current location, and Izuku knew it was only a matter of time before it was found. Standing next to the woman, she glanced over at him as he stared at the new uniform that she was currently in the process of making. Well, Midoriya-kun, what can I do for you today? She asked with a smile. Did you know how to make a nightmare stop? Izuku asked, looking around the room for an exit. Do I know how to make nightmares stop? I haven't been asked this kind of question before. Any reason as to why you are coming to me about this? 𝗵𝗃𝗃 parroted before asking a little more concerned. I've been having nightmares, and I just wanted to know if there was some device that could I don't know make them go away. Izuku asked, rubbing the back of his neck. I've never heard of such a device, but you can know that if I am able to make such device, I would be glad to give it to you. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said, as Izuku looked even more troubled. With that said, she patted his shoulder as the young man left the room. When he was gone, she let her expression fall from what was a happy one into a very worried and concerned one as she silently prayed that he gets better dreams from here on out. With Izuku, the young man moved towards the cafeteria as he wanted to actually get something to eat for breakfast, and considering what happened the last time he went there, he wanted to make sure he got his food and ate it somewhere else, not wanting to make everyone not feel happy with his presence. He would enter the cafeteria and find it completely empty as he let out a sigh of relief. Moving to the front area just outside of the kitchen, he asked for some breakfast to be made by 𝗵𝗲 as the man nodded at him and began to cook something for the boy to eat. That was until he noticed that Izuku was appearing to be suffering from being incapable of sleeping and moved near him as he cooked on the stove under the entrance to the kitchen window. "So, anything you want to talk about, kid?" 𝗵𝗲 asked, looking at Izuku's slumped form. I don't want to burden you with my issues," Izuku said, looking away as 𝗵𝗲 sighed. "You won't be able to move on from what happened if you don't talk about it," 𝗵𝗲 warned as Izuku looked up at him for a moment. For a few seconds the boy looked to be thinking about talking about what was clearly wrong with him. As shown under his eyes were dark bags that showed a clear lack of sleep, and as he looked around the cafeteria, he found that nobody was here still as he sighed for a moment before looking at 𝗵𝗲. "He been having nightmares?" Izuku said, as 𝗵𝗲 pounced on this information. "What are they about?" he asked softly. "The 𝗵𝘃𝗃 singularity and 𝗧𝗪𝙢𝙢𝗢," Izuku said, as 𝗵𝗲 looked confused. "What does 𝗧𝗪𝙢𝙢 have to do with this nightmare?" 𝗵𝗲 questioned. It's where I used to go to school," Izuku said as he rubbed his left shoulder. "I see, can you tell me something then?" 𝗵𝗲 questioned as Izuku glanced up at him. "What is it?" Izuku asked, looking confused. "Does this dream have anything to do with a young man with ash blonde hair and ruby red eyes, as well as a power to control explosions just as much as his personality is one?" 𝗵𝗲 asked. Izuku stayed quiet for a moment, making 𝗵𝗲 wonder if he pushed a little too hard on the boy as he heard a small sigh. Looking at Izuku, the young man looked to be so done with everything as he pulled his legs up to his knee, making 𝗵𝗲 remember that the boy was dreadfully short and skinny compared to most of the others in Chaldea. Taking a closer look at the boy now, he found that the skin on his face, the baby fat on his cheeks were quiet, literally hiding the fact that he didn't eat a whole lot before coming here. And from what he can see about Izuku's choice of clothing, he clearly prefers to wear clothing that hides what his body looks like underneath. "Why, Izuku said, bringing 𝗵𝗲 out of his reverie and focusing on his cooking. "Except, I wonder if my life would be better if director had grown up with me," Izuku said, looking at the ground. "You can never prepare for a future like that, kid. Life isn't so nice to most people," 𝗵𝗲 said, offhandedly. "Trust me, I know that personally," Izuku's voice said, causing 𝗵𝗲 to look over and see a dulled expression on the boy's face. "How about you talk about it? Tell me what life was like before Chaldea," 𝗵𝗲 said, as Izuku stared at him for a moment. I guess my life started get worse after I was diagnosed as quirkless," Izuku said, as 𝗵𝗲 thought about the boy's words. "You're telling me the fox ears and tail are clearly not a quirk?" 𝗵𝗲 questioned, as Izuku nodded. "The doctors here in Chaldea made sure to know that I had the second toe joint in my pinky toe. They were very clear about their hatred towards me afterwards," Izuku said, now looking away. "What does that have to do with anything?" 𝗵𝗲 asked, as Izuku chuckled darkly. "In the time we live in now quirkless people are looked down upon. I'm supposedly living in a world that doesn't want my presence around them at all," Izuku said, as 𝗵𝗲 nodded. "So, after this diagnosis what happened?" 𝗵𝗲 asked, looking at Izuku as he finished breakfast. "What do you think?" I was betrayed by those I viewed as my friends. They saw me as someone who was useless. I even believed them for a time. But the only one who even stayed near me was my mother, as she was the only one who showed genuine kindness to me, even if she protected me as though I were made of glass," Izuku said with a sigh. "If you were of age, I'd be trying to give you a drink," 𝗵𝗲 said, chuckling. "That wouldn't even be the worst of it. Every day I'm bullied relentlessly by my peers, my teachers, and random civilians who know my diagnosis. It's like I have the plague," Izuku said, as 𝗵𝗲 glanced at Izuku. The boy was clearly feeling as though he wanted to be anywhere but here right now. Judging by how he was wringing his hands as he waited to get breakfast, and 𝗵𝗲 looked down at the American-style breakfast of cheesy eggs, ham, and buttered toast. Finishing his things, 𝗵𝗃𝗲 gave Izuku the breakfast that he was waiting for and prepared for Izuku to leave. That was until Izuku called out to him again. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 do you think that someone without a power can become a hero? Izuku asked, looking at him in the eye. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 had no idea what prompted him to tell what he had to the boy. But when seeing the smile on Izuku's face, he couldn't help but letting out a small smile of his own as he rubbed the boy's hair and even scratching behind the boy's fox ears. After that, the boy left the cafeteria as his tail swished back and forth as he left the place, just as a few other mages and Chaldea staff had entered the cafeteria in order to collect some breakfast for themselves. 0W0? Izuku stood in the training room around a couple of hours later as he thought about what he should do with his new appendages. They were clearly far better than his original ones were, as his sense of hearing and smell were increased by at least double or triple the power they originally held as a normal human. Taking a deep sniff of the air, he looked around the simulation of a forest as he searched for his opponent of this little training session. And as he leaped around a random tree, he found his opponent as he reached out and grabbed them from around the face and tossed them out of their hiding spot. 𝗵𝗃𝗃 tumbled across the ground from the sheer surprise of Izuku finding her so fast. As she got back up to her feet, Izuku leaped at her from a nearby tree branch as she pulled up her shield and blocked his attack on her, as she then kicked him in the gut, sending him flying in the air. Rushing to catch up to him, Izuku flipped in the air as he landed on another tree branch as he disappeared into the trees, causing her to stand in the middle of the simulated forest. Looking in all directions, she heard him jumping from tree to tree as he then leaped towards her as she swung her shield at him as he tried to maneuver around her shield whilst airborne. But it was useless as she slammed the side of the shield right into the bottom of his jaw, slamming him over into a tree. As he groaned slightly whilst under the tree as a whole, 𝗵𝗃𝗃 walked over to him as she placed her hand on his jaw, causing him to groan even more in pain. She lifted him over her shoulder. "Romani, please end the simulation," 𝗵𝗃𝗃 called out as the simulation ended. "What did you find out about his new abilities?" Romani's voice rang out. "Well, his sense of smell and sight have definitely improved, but his skill with hand-to-hand is slowly improving as well. But he still needs time to master his new fighting style, and he didn't use his bow in order to fight me." 𝗵𝗃𝗃 explained. "He probably didn't wish to use it against you. Most definitely because he thought that your defense was too high for it to even work against you," Romani said as 𝗵𝗃𝗃 thought about this. "So he didn't take me seriously?" she asked, concerned. "No, he took you completely seriously. The thing he wanted to do today was to see how much his senses have increased from what they used to be. Don't think that he wasn't taking you as seriously as he would any other opponent. He wouldn't ever think that way towards you," Romani said, smiling at her. "Okay, I should probably bring Senpai to the medical bay," 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said as she hauled the boy away. With Romani alone in the simulation compartment, he let out a sigh of relief. He looked at the simulation recording as he watched as Izuku basically stalked 𝗵𝗃𝗃 as she moved throughout the forest, and he was concerned for what Izuku's species had meant. Foxes were meant to be cunning, deceptive, and most importantly intelligent. He showed a lot of intelligence when it came to working with others, as he showed that he could meld into any group of mages as well as departments within Chaldea. But there was one thing that he just couldn't see eye to eye with most of the mages within Chaldea as a whole. It was how servants were to be treated as they lived with them. Izuku treated each servant that he'd summoned as though they were an actual living person, not that they weren't in between those kinds of thoughts. But it clearly showed that if Izuku was in a Holy Grail war at some point in the future, he'd be their perfect emperor. He trusted each servant with such a large amount that he coincidentally made them lower their guards around him because he was just that lovable. Sighing to himself, he looked over at the other side of the room as he saw 𝗵𝗃𝗃 looking over the recording as well, and she was frowning to herself. "Is something wrong?" Romani asked. He got sloppy in his fighting style. He never telegraphs when his next attack was coming. He always feints when he tries to attack. "I saw the bags under his eyes the other day when he came to me. I thought nothing of it at first, but this is becoming a problem, Romani," 𝗵𝗃𝗃 said, looking worried. "So he isn't getting sleep?" Romani questioned. "That's clearly it. The problem is, what are these dreams of his about?" 𝗵𝗃𝗃 questioned. Inside of the medical bay, Izuku was sleeping on the cot as 𝗵𝗃𝗃 waited for Romani to show up and do a checkup on the young fox boy. As she absent-mindedly pats his head whilst scratching behind his fox ears, she began to think about the fight in general they had for training purposes. The young man was being far more telegraphing with his attacks, jumping from tree to tree in such a loud way that she could easily understand where he was going. It was how she was able to predict where he was going to attack her at in the simulation, so when he telegraphed his attack, she saw that there were dark bags under his eyes, and she knocked him out as fast as possible. Oh, Mash looked around the room for where the weird sound came from. As she glanced around the place, she unknowingly moved her hand down to scratch under the boy's chin before her fingers felt a weird rumbling feeling from the boy's neck. Looking back at Izuku, she found herself staring in awe as the boy had an expression of pure bliss on his unconscious face as he purred loudly in the room as she began to blush, and promptly began to record this event for the future. She couldn't be blamed for wanting to remember this in the future, right? Midoriya Izuku servant, unknown quirk status, quirkless mage abilities, bow manipulation, energy, arrow manipulation, magic defense, magic resistance, level 2, magical prowess, amateur, MSTR experience, novice. Favorite servant, amongst those he summoned, 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏. The servant named 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 is known as one of the most powerful Berserker class servants. Mainly because of his legend of being able to survive death a supposed 12 times with a rumor that he had a 13th LBR that was unknown to anyone. Due to his inability to talk to his emissary, Izuku had learned that from body language as well as certain grunts meant certain words. And with that he managed to keep up with 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 in a conversation, even though everyone around him believed him to be going crazy. Another reason why he likes 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 so much is due to his undying love of the #1 hero of Japan and possibly the world in his time, All Might. Izuku was in the middle of training his bowman skills as he heard rumors of Romani finding another singularity. It wasn't a whole lot of information, but all he knew was that the man was researching deeply about the singularity that he'd be entering with Mashu and that he will inform him about where it takes place as soon as his research is complete. How the man was going to research about a singularity and get back to him on it was beyond him. But he wasn't going to complain about getting more training to use a bow from 𝗵𝗃, as the man seemed to have fun teaching him all about those kinds of skills. So as he leaped around the simulation and used the bow he was given to by 𝗵𝗃 himself, he shot magical arrows at the targets that 𝗵𝗃 had set up for him. As he shot multiple arrows as fast as he could in a consecutive fashion, he couldn't help but think that had he gotten this ability sooner he wouldn't be here right now. After all, this all happened due to his presence here at Chaldea, and with him being the last emissary for humanity, he felt a large amount of weight on his shoulders for if he failed. He took a deep breath as he charged his last magical arrow and launched it towards his last target before he landed on the ground on his hands and feet. For weeks since the 𝗵𝗃𝗃 singularity, he had been training as strong as he could in order to become stronger. Strong enough to prevent unneeded deaths from those around him, and he wanted to make sure that his failure to save Olga back in 𝗵𝗃𝗃 was because he was weak and not scared. He walked over to 𝗵𝗃 as the man took a gander at each and every target that Izuku had shot at. He inspected the damage dealt to them as he placed a finger on each of the burn marks on the targets. All before he pulled his own bow and replicated the shot that Izuku had done, which left the boy stunned at how 𝗵𝗃 was able to replicate a magical arrow like his own on a much stronger scale. So your power works as an adrenaline-powered magical arrow. That's new to see. How many arrows can you produce from your magecraft alone, Midoriya? 𝗵𝗃 asked as he looked over at the boy. I think I can create around at least 10 before I start to exhaust myself, Izuku said, before 𝗵𝗃 nodded. When it's time for the singularity you will need to be capable of pushing beyond your limits. And once you are able to do that, you will be far more capable of reaching a new limit that your body sets up for you. Although, be sure to not hit allies with that kind of power. You could kill them accidentally. To be fair though, you wouldn't hit them unless they asked for it, 𝗵𝗃 said, as Izuku tilted his head in confusion. With that the two left the simulation room so that Izuku could get some rest before the next singularity. And walking towards the cafeteria, he felt his ears wiggle and twitch as he heard the sounds of those coming closer to his location as he moved as quickly as he could towards the cafeteria. It was breakfast after all, and he wanted to leave with a full stomach before asking Romani if he found the singularity like the rumors have stated or not. The man was kind towards him, But at the same time Izuku was more concerned with what the man was hiding behind that personality, as from his personal experience nobody was that kind towards him. So as he walked through the halls, he came across a scene that was kind of weird for him. Heracles was standing in the middle of the hall as a few of the other mages were hanging from his arms as though they were little kids compared to him, although that probably was what he viewed them as. But as soon as the giant muscular man noticed Izuku's presence in the hall, he dropped the other mages as they were glaring at the boy with disdain as Heracles had stopped in front of him. He checked the boy over for any kind of injuries and expressed his thankfulness through grunts and growls. "Hey Heracles. It's nice to see you again. How has your tea time been?" Izuku asked, as Heracles tilted his head before grunting. "Gra-urg." Heracles just grunted. "Che. I'm not that bad. I just need to get used to my new appendages." Izuku said, his eyes closed as he swung his arms in an up and down motion. "Thra." Heracles growled out, as Izuku stopped his tantrum. I know you worry about me Heracles, but I'm fine. Why you don't need to worry about me?" Izuku said, looking at the gentle giant with a soft look. "How can you understand him? He's just grunting and growling." One of the mages yelled as Izuku finally noticed their presence. I learned how to co-communicate with JSL. Izuku said, as the other mages looked confused. "JSL? What's that?" One of the mages asked, confused. "JSL is my nation's version of sign language. It's called Japanese Sign Language," Izuku stated as the others just stared at him. "And you taught that beast?" The mages all looked at Heracles, who growled at them for their wording. "𝗧𝗏." The mages finished. "What's wrong with trying to communicate with a servant? Teach their people too," Izuku said as Heracles looked at him with a beaming, prideful smile. "They're not people. They're dead people who you summoned to save the world." The mages yelled at him. From the mages yelling at him, Izuku winced as his fox ears fell onto his head with his tail between his legs. Heracles noticed Izuku's lowering mood before he glared at the mages who dared to talk about his 𝗵𝗃 like this before summoning his 𝗵𝗃 and pointing it at them, catching Izuku's attention. Looking up, he found a few fearful mages as they turned around and ran off towards what he assumed would have been Romani's office as he looked at Heracles. The giant of a man was beaming with pride at having scared of potential enemies from his threats to his survival. "Why, you didn't have to do that, Heracles," Izuku said, tapping the giant's bicep. "I just wish to protect you from those who emotionally hurt you." Heracles signed in JSL. What would I ever do without you guys?" Izuku asked, with comical tears in his eyes. 0W0, walking into the cafeteria, Izuku and Heracles were seen moving towards the open window as he took note of Altoria as she sat at the window. Her face was in bliss as she was eating Amiya's food as her body danced slightly in her seat as Izuku took his own seat right next to her, causing her to glance at him. Her eyes widened a bit before shaking her head at him before focusing on her food, whilst also protecting it from the boy believing him to be a foe for her food. "I'm not going to steal your food, Artoria-san," Izuku said, with an exasperated expression. "Who says that you would not take it?" Artoria growled with food in her mouth. "What have I said about talking with your mouth full?" Izuku asked, his stuttering tone stern. Finishing the food in her mouth, she glared at him before speaking in a tone that was not very happy. "Not to speak until it's finished," she said, as Izuku nodded. "Yes, and why you need to know that and nobody would eat your food. There's enough for everyone," Izuku said, as Artoria Alter just growled. "Who died to make you our mom?" she muttered under her breath. I'm pretty sure that would have been Izuku went to retort before he fell silent. Altoria just stared at him confused for a second before looking at Heracles as the giant of a servant just shook his head. He used 𝗔𝗨 towards Altoria as she noticed his sign language and recognized why Izuku had gone silent. He was about to bring up the name of a dead woman, one who he barely had time to get to know. She was about to speak to him as Izuku took a deep breath and Amiya walked over to the boy holding a plate of 𝗧𝗏𝗏. "One plate of 𝗧𝗏𝗏 for a boy who clearly needs more meat in his meals," Amiya said as Izuku blushed after being pulled out of the memory. "Sorry. I'll get right to eating." Izuku apologized before digging in. Sorry for forcing those memories onto you, Altoria said, looking back at her food. Don't worry about it. I'll be fine. I always find a way to get over things like this. Izuku muttered as he continued to eat. Half an hour later, Izuku found himself standing just outside of Romani's office as he entered it. Walking through the door, he found the man looking over the console for showing him where new singularities were located. Standing next to the man, his tail flicked back and forth as he looked on in curiosity at the giant touchscreen table as he watched Romani and 𝗵𝗃 at work. The two were bringing things together as they were coming up with whatever was causing the next singularity before they finally noticed a flickering tail moving back and forth. Looking down to Izuku, they found what they saw was a chibi version of him pouting at them as he looked at them. There was silence for a moment before Romani sighed before petting Izuku's head, causing him to flinch slightly before warily leaning into the touch of the man scratching. So we've found where the next singularity is located. But we were just doing some extra research about where the singularity takes place. What we found out so far was that it takes place in France. Romani said, as Izuku looked intrigued. The only thing that gains my full attention is the time when Jeanne d'Arc was around. She was a very focal person during her time alive. Izuku said, as both 𝗵𝗃 and Romani stared at him in confusion. How do you know about her? Romani asked, as Izuku shrugged. When you're quirkless, why you find some outlets in order to try and fit in? Izuku said as he stared at the time. Well, Romani went to speak before the timeline showed up. The 100 Years' War. Romani shouted. All right here. Izuku winced pained. Sorry kid, but the new singularity is taking place in New Orleans during the 100 Years' War. Just around the end of Jean's life. From what I am seeing, she was killed 3 days ago if we go by today in there, but something is off about it. There appears to be someone causing a ruckus with the timeline. Someone is impersonating Jeanne d'Arc. Romani said, growling angrily. Then we need to get out there and stop them? Izuku said, his tail flicking back and forth determinedly. Just make sure to gather your supplies. You never know how long you'll be staying there. Romani said, as Izuku nodded. As the boy ran off, his tail flicking left and right, 𝗵𝗃 looked at Romani with a smile. Walking over to his side, she elbowed him softly in the side as he glanced over at her with a frown of his own. What? He asked as 𝗵𝗃 smirked. I saw what you did with him. That was adorable, she said, smiling at him. You didn't see anything. That was me giving a child the attention he deserved. Romani said, as he placed a hand over his face. I didn't see anything, but you can't deny the truth. He's growing on you a little, she said as she walked towards the door. I know, but at the same time, I'm growing worried about his wariness towards me. Romani said as 𝗵𝗃 looked at him confused. He trusted you enough to pet his head, she said, as Romani shook his head. He didn't trust me at all. He flinched before my hand was on his head, but leaned into the touch as soon as he felt it was safe. He gave me a distrustful expression, 𝗵𝗃. He hasn't gotten any kind of emotional and physical affection for what seems to be years that can't be healthy. Romani said, concerned. I'm sure that he can get some on this adventure. I mean, he's going to France with Mashu? 𝗵𝗃 said, chuckling. They're too young to be doing that. Romani yelled, just as Mashu entered the room. We're too young to do what? Mashu asked, confused. You'll find out when you're older, he yelped as 𝗵𝗃 laughed. About an hour later of collecting everything needed for this trip, the group was seen standing in front of the pods. Looking up at Romani, the man happily smiled down at Izuku as the boy entered the pod next to Mashu as the girl smiled at him after climbing inside the pod of her own. As soon as the ray shifting began, Izuku felt himself slowly fall unconscious inside as his tail wrapped itself around his arms in order to keep him warm. A blue light enveloped his vision as his body had immediately disappeared from the pod, with Mashu not far behind him as the room became enveloped in a blue glow. As Izuku was ray-shifting, he felt a disturbance in the air as though something was forcing him to see what was happening at the moment. Looking around the area he found himself in, he saw that he was completely encapsulated in a weird black and green mist that covered him head to toe all except for his eyes. He found himself standing in a throne room as he realized that he was in the French royal palace, and not too far away from the king was a woman who was wearing a black knightess dress. She had pale yellow hair and golden eyes just like Altoria. What really set her off to him though was how she seemingly noticed his presence and just ignored him entirely. He watched as she walked over to the king, who was just staring at her in complete shock. Who are you? You are a witch, aren't you? The king called out fearfully. Oh, is that how you react to me after you burned me at the stake? Oh wait, you didn't do that, but the British did. The woman growled, holding the man up at his collar. Jajing, he called out fearfully. In the BLD, though I'd rather not be having my name stated by rubbish filth like you. So, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to kill you. Take your place as Queen of France, and then I will direct our forces towards those British that you sent me to. The woman growled. Why, you'll never get far. The king growled as the woman chuckled. It was here that Izuku took note of the other presences inside the throne room. Their presences were covered in darkness, but Izuku noticed how they were brainwashed servants. And they didn't appear to be very friendly, but they all looked in the direction that his vestige was presiding at the moment before looking at the woman, Jeanne d'Arc. So someone is peeking in on a conversation that they have no clue is about. Fine, let them hear, they won't get far anyway. Jeanne said as she pulled out her flagpole and pierced the king in the gut. With this, chaos can reign over all of France. The British can be beaten out of our country and I can become the new ruler, she said, with a smile before looking at where Izuku was. Find the person who is projecting themselves here. I will not have them destroying my plans. Jeanne said, as Izuku felt himself pulled from this weird dream. But he did hear what one of the servants call her. Yes, Dragon Witch. Dragon Witch. Jeanne wasn't a witch. Izuku thought to himself before he felt something tapping his cheek. Opening his eyes, he found Mashu standing above him with a concerned expression on her face. She appeared to have been poking his face for a while, as she had a small blush on her face from poking it an unknown number of times, and as he sat upright, she helped him stand upright as he looked forwards. Izuku, can you hear me? Romani's voice rang out. L loud and C clear. Izuku stuttered out. Hey, you're alive. I kind of dropped you both at a high altitude, sorry about that. But you were unconscious, what happened? Romani asked, as Izuku shook his head. See, can you search up a name real quick? Izuku asked, as Romani grunted. What name do you want me to search up? He questioned. Dragon Witch. Izuku said as the others looked at him confused. The person who is causing all this destruction is the Dragon Witch, Izuku said without stuttering. As Izuku got up from the ground, he felt his ears twitch at the vast amounts of magical energy moving about him. Standing up, he took in his surroundings as he found himself in a vast field that belonged to France just after Jeanne d'Arc's death, as the grass and flowers fluttered in the wind. Taking a deep breath, he found Mashu standing not too far away from him as she was taking in the timeline which they had come to in order to stop the destruction of humanity. Mashu, did you see what I saw? Izuku asked, holding his head. Not what you saw. All I saw was the blue light of the ray shift program actually going through before coming here. What did you see? Mashu asked. I saw a woman. She was wearing dark clothing similar to what Jeanne d'Arc wore as a knightess. But something was off about how she acted. She acted like a monster, as though she couldn't care less about whatever was happening to France. Izuku said as he stumbled over to her. Do you think we're having a Saber Alter problem? She asked, concerned. Although, this altar has already done something that wasn't supposed to happen. Izuku clarified as Mashu looked confused. What was that? She asked. She killed the French king already, speaking as though she was a deity. But some of the servants from what I saw called her the Dragon Witch. Izuku said as Mashu thought about it. Romani, was there a legend about Jeanne d'Arc where she was portrayed as someone who tamed dragons? Mashu asked as Romani searched it up where he was. Last I checked, there wasn't any kind of information about Jeanne that stated anything about her being a dragon witch. But the powers she wielded were similar to that of a dragon's back when she was alive, so it could be possible that they are comparing her magical prowess to that of a witch. Romani said as he came up with a blank. That just means that we need to stop whatever she plans on doing with France. Izuku said, with a determined glare towards the distance. So where should we go first, Romani? Mashu asked as Romani thought about it. Go towards 𝗧𝗵𝗃, that is where I can see the highest form of magical presence in this time PRD. Just be careful, Romani said, as they nodded at the wrist gauntlet on Izuku's arm. For a few minutes of walking down the grass pathway, the two just remained silent as Izuku's foxtail had swished back and forth with his ears twitching at each and every sound that he could hear. Mashu watched his expression with a smile on her face before looking at everything that she could see. This was the first time aside from the 𝗵𝘃𝗁𝗏 singularity that she was even able to leave Chaldea. It was nice for her to see this kind of thing since she'd probably never live long enough to see it after their trip through time was done. Izuku, however, noticed her melancholic expression as he watched her visible awe from how her eyes took in everything. A blush coming to his face as he finally realized that he was walking next to what was, as his brain kept informing him, was a very appealing young woman who didn't hate his guts or mock him for merely existing. He smacked himself internally for even thinking about that before shaking his head as they continued down the path. They weren't even more than a few hundred meters away from their original spot as Izuku felt himself immediately tense. Looking around in confusion, he didn't know what could be forcing him to act like this when there was literally nobody around that could be threatening him at the moment. Looking at Mashu, he found that she was walking around as though nothing was even watching her as she took in the sights with a happy smile on her face. Call him paranoid, but he'd rather be safe than sorry as he didn't want to be snuck up upon without anyone noticing. He sent a Morse code signal to Romani asking for certain information about the area they were in as Romani was confused by the Morse code. All before summoning himself through a hologram into the area on Izuku's wrist before looking at the boy. He appeared to be very pale as he was searching the surroundings, with a very tense expression on his face. Hey Midoriya-kun, do you need to take a break from all this walking? You look really pale. Romani asked, concerned. I'm fine, just nervous. It feels as though I'm being watched. Izuku mumbled before someone leaped out at them. That's because you were. A voice rang out. Turning around to look at the new arrival in confusion and fear, Izuku found himself at the edge of a flagpole as it pointed at his throat with him raising his hands immediately on instinct. The woman in front of him bore a very great resemblance to the dragon that he'd seen in his weird vision/dream from the ray shift. The woman seemingly took in his expression before speaking towards him in a tone that meant he should listen. Before you question who I really am, just know that I am a friendly. I would much rather not have you all attacking me for no reason, she said, as Izuku gulped and stepped a few feet back. Who are you? And why are you threatening Senpai? Mashu called out, holding her shield in front of her. I'm not threatening him, I'm just stating that I'd rather not fight a potential ally. I'm trying to get the reputation that I've had restored because of the Dragon Witch. She's using my face in order to cause everything that I've fought for to personally end. The woman said, stabbing her flagpole into the ground. My name is Jean Dark, servant ruler. Although, in this time PRD I had died due to giving myself up to the king due to the enemy not wanting me on the battlefield. I took my death in service to the Lord. The woman said, introducing herself. Are you really Jean Dark? Because you're supposed to be dead. Mashu asked with a bewildered expression. I just stated my name though. The woman said, as Izuku chose that moment to pass out. He could stand being around Mashu, as she was the only one he could handle to talking to. But two very appealing women, both with very questionable outfits, causing his mind to have an information overload, and he passed out due to many images entering his mind that he didn't want. 0W0, with Izuku out cold and swirls in his eyes, Mashu took it upon herself to set up camp in the middle of nowhere. She had even taken advantage of the moment she had alone with Jean in order to learn more about the woman's country during this time PRD. Something that Jean herself had enjoyed talking about to the girl, glad that she could listen to her prattle on about the country she loved to protect during a time of war. Although she wished that the 𝗵𝘃𝗁𝗏 of humanity didn't pass out from whatever caused him do that. Does he always pass out like that? Jean asked, eventually. When he gets around women it happens a lot. Although I personally think it happens a lot more around women that he finds really attractive. Mashu said with a blush on her face. It's because of our outfits, isn't it? 𝗓𝗓 questioned as she sighed. I'm not going to answer that. 𝗵𝗃 said looking at Izuku. The boy had changed positions whilst passed out and now laid on his stomach with his face in the dirt. She smiled as she rubbed his hair with her fingers, getting a specific part of his hair just behind his fox ears, soliciting a purr from him as 𝗓𝗓 heard it as well. I didn't know that fox hybrids could even purr. I've never heard one purr before. 𝗓𝗓 said, moving over to his tail and softly sifting a hand through it. What neither of them realized, however, was that Izuku was already awake from this kind of touching. And it was taking everything he had within him to not immediately rush away in fear of being touched too much. And as he felt 𝗓𝗓's admittedly soft hands sifting through the fur on his tail, he shivered imperceptibly that 𝗓𝗓 caught for all but a second but blew it off to him, reacting to her cold touch. The two soon devolved into talking about what the whole singularity could be about as Izuku listened on in bliss. He wouldn't admit it to anyone, but he really liked being doted on by the two girls before he decided to sit upright but not telling the two to stop. He glanced at each one as 𝗵𝗃 kept her hands on his head, giving him all the head pats that he could ever ask for, but he then did something to her that she never predicted would happen. He pulled her into a hug as 𝗓𝗓 stayed connected to his tail as it wrapped around her hands softly. The two looked at one another in confusion before 𝗓𝗓 attempted to pull away from the tail as it slowly tried to stay in her hand. I don't mind you pipetting the tail, and just tell me that why you are doing it? Izuku said, face covered in a massive blush. Okay, so the place we should be heading to is Vour's. Romani had stated that he had noticed a large magical presence there. 𝗵𝗃 said, as 𝗓𝗓 agreed. That was actually where I was going. I hope you two can assist me on the journey there. 𝗓𝗓 said, as Izuku nodded. Having more help in this time PRD, as well as someone who's lived here her entire life, is a good thing to have. Not to mention we can help you with talking to the other servants to see if they would like to join us. Izuku said, fully in Save the World mode. For the next couple of hours, the trio would talk to one another before the day had soon turned into night. The three were sitting in front of a campfire as they were cooking some fish that 𝗵𝗃 had brought to them via Izuku summoning him. And the fish were actually being cooked by the fire to keep them fed until they reached the city, and Izuku had the time to actually listen to 𝗓𝗓's stories of her time as a knightess. He wrote down each and every endeavor that she went on, even got her autograph as well whilst he was at it. But by the time they had to go to bed, Izuku stayed awake in order to keep the two safe. He may be the 𝗧𝗏 of humanity, but he was a boy/man first before anything else, but he'd rather not sleep at the moment. You never know when bandits could come along in order to do very malicious things to sleeping women. He stayed sitting staring at the sky when 𝗓𝗓 roused from her slumber to see Izuku staring at the clear sky. Is something the matter? She asked, as Izuku glanced over at her. Just I have been wondering about whether or not I can even return to the place I called home, Izuku said as he stared at the sky. His facial features were hidden to her by him staring at the sky right at the moment. So she couldn't read what his expression was showing in terms of his emotions, but she did think of one thing to get him to look at her. Are you even wanting to return to the life you had once had? 𝗓𝗓 asked, curious. I've been respected and disrespected at Chaldea, but the respect came from me being the last emperor of humanity. I don't even know what I'm doing. All I'm doing is just flailing my arms around and praying that something works. I'm not very confident, if you've already seen. Izuku said, chuckling darkly at the end. You have a low self-worth? She surmised as Izuku nodded before pulling his legs into his 𝗧𝗏 and sitting his chin on his knees. It wasn't something that was randomly there. I've always had confidence issues. But my peers brought that to the maximum as I grew up. You know, in a world filled with superpowers, when the one person doesn't get one of those powers, they are treated as though they're second-class citizens at best. At worst, they're treated as though their mere existence is a slight on everyone's lives. Izuku said, looking down. Why are you telling me this? 𝗓𝗓 questioned, not really seeing what he was getting at with this. 𝗓𝗓, if you saw a group of kids beating down another kid, only the group of kids have magic, and the kid who is getting beaten up doesn't have magic. What would you do? Izuku asked as he looked into 𝗓𝗓's blue eyes. I would most certainly help the boy/girl who is getting beaten down, she said, as Izuku nodded. Nobody ever came to my rescue, Nobody even cared about me aside from my mother. Before I came to Chaldea, my mother and I would get death threats from people who really hated on the quirkless. Izuku said, looking at her with a sad expression. What is the whole meaning of your questions? Jean asked, confused. What would you do if you had the worst day of your life? Like say your friend, someone who you've looked up to your entire life as a symbol of victory, had one day told you to kill yourselves in order to become a hero. Not only that, but when meeting the person who you idolized ever since childhood, they tell you that attaining your dreams of being a hero was impossible. Izuku asked as Jean thought about it. I would continue to strive to become a hero no matter the cost. Jean said as Izuku looked her in the eye. Even if you're beaten down for your dreams? Izuku asked as Jean looked at him. Of course I would. She retorted. Even if they destroy your things? Izuku asked again. Yes. She replied. Even if they all leave scars on your body in a way that you have to hide them from everyone and hide your true feelings behind a mask that was created to protect yourself? Izuku asked, looking into her eyes. Did you give up? She asked, looking in his eyes. Izuku kept her stare as his eyes looked up at the sky before he sighed. He took off the shirt he wore as he placed it right next to himself before beckoning her to come over to him. Once she was behind his back, she used magic to light up the darkness surrounding his back, before looking at the number of scars on his back. She instinctively nearly placed a hand over the largest scar on his back in the shape of 2 words. I was forced over and over and over again to bear with the pain of being beaten until unconsciousness because nobody liked how I talked about wanting to be a hero. They viewed me as a threat to their own dreams. Being quirkless in a society where they praise quirks is a death sentence for those who are like me. Izuku said, as he felt Jean place a hand on his back where his largest scar was. Jean looked at the largest scar with the greatest amount of disgust for humanity she could ever feel. The fact that this boy, who had just wanted to become similar to the heroes around him, was beaten down by a society where he was raised to believe anyone could become a hero only to be rejected at every pathway. A great rage hidden in her heart wanted to be freed in this moment, but since they were in the past she couldn't do that. Not only that, but she'd lose her saint status if she did. Have you tried to learn self-defense to prevent beatings like that? She asked. I have, but the beatings were 10 times worse when I fought back. Not only that, but the teachers would keep me after class in order to help those students. Izuku said, looking away. Jean looked back at Izuku's back, looking at the words inscribed on his back. Worthless Deku. She glanced back at Izuku for a moment to find his eyes having bags under them as she spoke to him. You should get some sleep. I'll watch you both and keep you two safe, she said, as Izuku glanced at her. Are you sure? He asked. I'm sure, she replied by patting his head softly. Sorry for the talk. I don't know why I asked you those things. Izuku said, laying down. You just wanted clarification if your dreams of becoming a hero could be true, she said, as Izuku fell asleep on the ground. Although I think a quirkless hero is indeed possible, she mumbled out near his ear so he could hear it. As she watched over Izuku and Mashu's sleeping bodies, she never saw the tears falling from the foxboy's eyes as he slept through the rest of the night. Izuku, Mashu and Jean continued down the path to 𝗲𝗂𝗪 without much fanfare after the night that Izuku revealed some more information to Jean about his past. He didn't know why he told her that stuff about himself the previous night, probably his subconscious wanting to let someone know at least a little bit more about himself that wasn't Mashu. He couldn't understand why he couldn't trust her for the life of him, but why he trusted Jean of all people surprised even himself. He shook his head as the trio walked down the pathway heading towards 𝗲𝗂𝗪 as they watched for anything dangerous that they could come across on their dangerous journey through the countryside. Mashu and Jean were talking to one another once more as they spoke about what life was like back when Jean was still learning how to be a knight for France, as apparently it was far harsher for the young woman, especially considering her age at the time of being around 19 as a young knight. Izuku stayed a bit behind the two girls as he thought about what he wanted to do after the singularity within France was dealt with. He still wished to become a hero, but at the same time he wanted to save the world with those who he summoned by his side right there to help him become the hero he wishes to be. That was when he looked back up at Jean and Mashu, who were happily talking to one another, sharing in a moment of reprieve as they did what most girls did: gossip. A small smile entered his face as he watched the two act like girls should with one another. Although it increased even more as he got to watch 𝗵𝗃 interact with another girl around her age, even if it made him sound like he was far older than she was. Shaking his head at the thought, he focused on sensing the surrounding area for anything that could surprise them since they were too focused on their journey. It still made him think twice about 𝗓𝗓 because the dragon which looked exactly like her. Just in a negative attitude as well as darker clothing, and he would have believed that Jeanne d'Arc was actually someone who really wanted vengeance against France for what they did to her. After everything she had done for her country, and what they did was basically betray her and send her to be killed by the British and burned at the stake for them believing her to be an actual witch. Sighing, Izuku found himself thinking a lot more than usual. He didn't know whether or not it was because the life he was currently living was vastly different from what it originally was, or if it was because he was saving the world. But at the end of the day, he couldn't help but smile at the fact that he's doing something he'd always wanted to do, save lives. Even if it meant that he'd never be given the satisfaction of everyone knowing that he made sure that they weren't incinerated by a mysterious being who wanted humanity gone. He looked off into the distance as he watched the sun rising further into the air of the French mountains as the area around them warmed up even further. Moving a little faster to keep up with the two girls, Izuku never noticed how Jeanne and 𝗵𝗃 were watching him shiver slightly from the cold morning air as he rushed to catch up to them. Their frowns never reaching his expression as he thought they were just frowning at the cold air around them instead of being annoyed at how distrustful of them he was. As soon as he moved ahead of the two, they gave one another a glance before shaking their heads and continuing their conversation with one another. So, what kind of backstory do you think Midoriya Senpai has that makes him so distrustful? 𝗵𝗃 asked, looking at Jeanne. I don't know, but from what I am seeing, he hates being stared at as though he's fragile. I don't know how I know this, but don't look at him like that, Jeanne said, as 𝗵𝗃 nodded her head. I can guess how his reaction to that would be though, 𝗵𝗃 said, looking at Izuku's back as he moved a little faster than the two. What do you imagine his reaction to you, Romani, or anyone at Chaldea treating him like glass would look like? Jeanne questioned softly. I don't know, and that is what I'm really scared of, 𝗵𝗃 said, as her wrist gauntlet lit up as a hologram of 𝗵𝗃 showed up. If you're wondering how his anger would show itself, you don't need to ask one another. Ask me, 𝗵𝗃 said as Jeanne looked at 𝗵𝗃. Do you know how he'd react to being treated like glass? Jeanne asked. How would you react to being treated like glass, Jeanne? 𝗵𝗃 questioned. Well, I certainly wouldn't like that, not to mention showing the power I have to reveal that I'm by no means weak, Jeanne said, as 𝗵𝗃 nodded. Now imagine your entire life, everyone, and I mean everyone, treating you like trash, your peers being so rude that your presence alone is so unwanted that your own mother wants to protect you but doesn't know how. So the only way they can protect you is by treating you as though you could break like glass. Can you imagine it now? 𝗵𝗃 questioned. There's no way his life is that bad, 𝗵𝗃-san. He doesn't show that kind of trauma, 𝗵𝗃 said, as 𝗵𝗃 looked at her next. What makes you think that he wants you to see that side of him? He asked before leaving. That just left even more questions in 𝗵𝗃's mind. What would Izuku look like if he was really off? If his emotions were carried on his sleeve as 𝗵𝗃-san had told her, if his anger was not something that you should want to be seen dealt upon someone else, why would he want to show someone that side of him? Shaking her head, she and Jeanne moved to catch up with Izuku as the young man had managed to gain some distance from them. Both unaware that he'd listened in on their conversation with 𝗵𝗃. 0W0? Izuku walked forwards without a destination in mind aside from Vaucouleurs as he moved along the grassy fields. Jeanne and 𝗵𝗃 had caught up with him by now and they were closing in on a small town that was protected by a large wooden gate and walls that surrounded it on all sides. But there was a large commotion off in the distance, so moving towards it, he naturally wanted to see if there was anyone in danger only for Jeanne to rush up ahead as well, moving far faster than him. Wait, Jeanne, Izuku called out as the woman rushed towards the knights. 𝗵𝗃 and Izuku ran as fast as they could in order to arrive at the scene before them. And when the two did, they found that the knights were fighting the skeletal warriors that they'd fought back in the Fuyuki Singularity. Just seeing those creatures again caused Izuku's mind to bring up a flash part of his memory of Olga being sent into the core of Chaldea again as he immediately pulled out his bow and energy arrows and started blasting. Rush the skeletal warriors and protect the knights with 𝗓𝗓. Izuku called out as the girl rushed in. As 𝗓𝗓 leaped into the fight spinning around horizontally, she swiped her flagpole in the air sending a group of the warriors down the grassy field. Mashu leaped up behind her as she slammed her shield into the ground causing a good portion of the group to be immediately crushed and turned into black smoke. 𝗓𝗓 was about to attack the warriors again when 3 energy arrows slammed right into the heads of 3 that were coming up behind her. Turning around, she found the 3 skeletal warriors falling to the ground and glanced back at Izuku, who nodded at her. Mashu leaped at another group of the warriors as she swung her shield left, slicing through one of the warriors in a clean swipe, slicing the monster in half from the waist down. 𝗓𝗓 twirled around Mashu's shoulder as she extended her flagpole over the girl's shoulder, piercing through another 2 skeletal warriors, causing them to erupt in black smoke. Then, to finish the last skeletal warrior, a green energy arrow smashed right between the eyes of the last skeletal warrior as it turned into black dust. 𝗬𝗲𝗵𝗃 aussi de nous avoir sauvé la vie. Who are you? And thank you for saving our lives. One of the soldiers called out. 𝗬𝗵𝗃 Izuku Midoriya 𝗬𝗵𝗃 Nous sommes Venus ICI pour aider. My name is Izuku Midoriya, and this is 𝗵𝗃. We came here to help. Izuku replied in perfect French. You didn't tell me you were fluent in French? Mashu whispered in Izuku's fox ear. I had extra time back at Chaldea. Izuku whispered back at her. Vous venez en paix. Alors pourquoi avez-vous la sorcière dragon avec vous? You come in peace. Then why do you have the dragon witch with you? The leading member of the soldiers questioned. Elle n'est pas un ennemi, ce n'est pas la sorcière dragon. C'est la vraie Jeanne d'Arc. She's not an enemy, this isn't the dragon witch. She's the true Jeanne d'Arc. Izuku replied as their voices soon became English as his clothing had allowed them to speak in their tongue. If you really are on our side, and that's really Jeanne, how is she still alive? We watched her die. The soldier said as Jeanne finally spoke. I know that it's been a few days since you last saw me burning on the stake. But something horrible is happening. Someone is using my face in order to cause France to fall. We need to work together in order to bring the dragon witch down. Jeanne said as the soldiers watched her with awe. Long live Jeanne d'Arc. Our holy maiden has finally returned. The other soldiers called out as the leading soldier took off his helmet. Jeanne, you've really returned. I've been so lost since your demise at the hands of those accursed Brits. Where have you been all this time? The man asked, revealing a pale face with dark black hair that was scraggly. I've been accepted into a place where my achievements in battle were celebrated for eternity. I was accepted into the throne of heroes. Jeanne replied as the man nodded. Well, 𝗧𝗪𝗧 is now at your service. If you need my assistance or the assistance of my resistance forces, then you will receive them. The soldier, 𝗧𝗪𝗧, said with a bow. Thank you, 𝗧𝗪𝗧, but can you point us in the direction of 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗔𝗪, please? These 2 are from a place in the far future, and we need to stop the problem stemming from my altered form. Jeanne said, as 𝗧𝗪𝗧 saluted to her and nodded. Just head down this road, follow it all the way through, and you should reach 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗔𝗪 in about a few days' time. But be careful about wyverns, we've been seeing them arrive around the place a lot. 𝗧𝗪𝗧 said, as Izuku looked downright confused. Wyverns, aren't they supposed to be myths? Izuku asked with a tilt of his head. Thank you, 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗔𝗪. I wish you the best until it's time for me to depart back into the throne of heroes. Jeanne said as 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗔𝗪 nodded his head. Until we meet again, my lovely Jeanne, 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗔𝗪 said, leading his men towards the next incoming village. Let's go, Izuku said, as the trio rushed down the path opposite to 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗔𝗪. 0W0, the path to 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗔𝗪 was long and arduous, and they still hadn't even gotten close to it on foot. Mashu and Jeanne were looking fine in the department when it came to endurance, whilst Izuku was slowing down with each and every mile they had gone through the vast expanse of France. He was heaving and hoeing as he tried to keep up with the 2 female servants as he lightly in order to make sure that he stayed at the same speed as the 2. As they reached a massive open area of grass and flowers, they decided to set up camp here. Izuku sat down on the grass as he stared up at the sky as he tried to gather his air and strength in order to help setting up the whole camp for the trio. He glanced at both 𝗵𝘃 and 𝗔𝗂𝘁 as he watched them set up the camp without him, and this caused his mind to immediately tell him to ignore the pain and exhaustion he was feeling in order to at least assist them. As it turned out, they were practically done with the camp. They were just needing some wood in order to create a campfire. But even then, they couldn't get a break as they heard a scream ring over the entire expanse of the French plains. Izuku looked up at the sky as he extended his sense of sound to the maximum in order to see if he can pinpoint where the scream came from and who did it. But he was coming up without anything to help as he glanced at the two girls who were looking at him for context. I know I heard the scream in that direction, but for some reason it felt as though it was coming in our direction. Izuku mumbled as he adopted a thinking pose. That was when the universe decided that he had enough time to think. As a gigantic wyvern had landed on the ground behind the trio, causing them to stumble and Izuku to just stare at the creature in both awe and growing worry as it glared down at the trio. It lifted its head up as Izuku was about to ask what it was going to do before it finished his thought process. Screeor! The wyvern screeched out, causing Izuku to fall on the ground holding his fox ears in pain. Ga! Izuku yelled in pain as he held his ears. Senpai! 𝗵𝘃 called out, rushing over to him. As 𝗵𝘃 was focused on Izuku and making sure that he was alright, 𝗔𝗂𝘁 immediately leaped at the creature. Stabbing it in the neck, the creature let out another shrill screech of pain, albeit far quieter than before as it struggled on the edge of her weapon. 𝗵𝘃, after making sure that Izuku was completely fine, leapt at the creature as well and smacked it right in the temple, knocking it to the ground. As it struggled to stand back up, 𝗔𝗂𝘁 prepared to pull her flagpole out of its neck before a green arrow had pierced through its eye and entering its skull. Looking over her shoulder, 𝗔𝗂𝘁 watched as Izuku stood there holding a bow and his ears twitched before he fell to the ground holding his ears. At least we know my ears are super sensitive. Izuku yelled out loud, temporarily deaf. Are you alright, senpai? 𝗵𝘃 asked, concerned deeply. What? I can't exactly hear you. Izuku yelled back at her. He's got temporary deafness. The wyvern must have overwhelmed his hearing. 𝗔𝗂𝘁 told 𝗵𝘃 as the girl looked guilty. It's fine, 𝗵𝘃. Why, you're not at fault, and none of us were prepared for it to arrive. Izuku yelled, tapping her shoulder softly. 𝗵𝘃 smiled at Izuku as the boy felt something drip out of his nose and scrunched his face a bit. Moving his hand towards his nose in order to see what was going on, he rubbed it softly before pulling his hand away from the opening. Looking at his hand, he found what he saw as completely weird. BLD was leaking from his nose as he heard Romani speaking to 𝗵𝘃, albeit very muffled. He's suffering extreme exhaustion. Allow him to rest for a while afterwards. You all can continue on your mission. Romani's muffled words came out. Sorry. Izuku muttered softly. You're not at fault, Izuku. You just used too much magical energy in the day. 𝗔𝗂𝘁 said, as Izuku nodded. Moving away from the girls, he laid down on the ground as he stared at the sky before a thought occurred to him. I just killed something. A creature of legend, and I did it so easily and I didn't even hesitate. Am I a murderer? Izuku's final thoughts ended on that before passing out. The sleep for Izuku felt longer than it actually was, as when he woke up from his slumber, he found 𝗔𝗂𝘁 and 𝗵𝘃 sleeping next to a put-out fire. Standing upright, he stretched his limbs as much as he could, until he heard a few pops and cracks from the bones inside his body as he shook his entire form with a shudder. His tail flicked side to side as he looked around the area before sniffing the air. Smelling the smoke of the campfire was easy, but he smelled something from farther out. He glanced over at 𝗵𝘃 and 𝗔𝗂𝘁 as the two remained asleep near the campfire as he walked towards where he was smelling a distinct scent. Walking down the path, he eventually came across a city blockaded by wooden walls surrounding the entire thing. Immediately recognizing the place as Vour's, he walked towards the entrance of the city as he explored the streets of New Orleans' smaller city within France. He saw that the place was completely devoid of all life and seemingly was surrounded by bodies belonging to the dead. He got near a certain building where the smell got worse for him, as though he were sniffing out a decaying corpse. As he removed some rubble, he couldn't help but place a hand over his mouth as he stared at the sight that laid before him. An elderly man laid with a large beam of wood holding his legs down as BLD was caked on his head from a head injury that had happened recently, but that wasn't what Izuku was looking at. It was the milky white eyes of the man as his head was tilted to the side, a clear indentation of his neck showing the bone that was about to pierce through the skin. The elderly man groaned as Izuku knelt by the man. "I'm sorry that we couldn't save you," Izuku mumbled as he pulled out a knife from his back pocket. Slowly pushing the sharp edge into the head of the elderly man, he watched as the eyes closed before he somehow turned into blue motes of light. Looking confused for a moment, he was about to stand up when a set of hands grabbed onto his shoulder and pulled him away before he found himself being pulled away from the house. He couldn't get a view of whoever had grabbed him, but they had then tossed him into the street as a sword was placed right in front of his face as he looked at it for a moment. "Qui iris?" the Frenchman called out, holding the blade closer to Izuku's throat. I am Izuku Midoriya. I am not your enemy." Izuku cried out as he watched the man take his helmet off. He revealed himself to be just a regular knight as he had short brown hair and blue eyes. He placed his sword back in his opposing hand before taking a deep breath and looking into Izuku's eyes. "I have come here to bring news of 𝗧𝗪𝗏's success in sending the forces of evil away from the capital," the soldier said as Izuku tilted his head. Then why did you pull me out of that house?" Izuku asked as the man sighed. "That was an undead. A spell was used on the people of each city. For every person that dies, they are reborn as an undead to continue the fight of our adversaries. Despicable that dragon which really is." The soldier growled as Izuku stood back up. Not too far away from the two, 𝗓𝗓 and 𝗵𝗃 had arrived as they had found him talking to a random knight. Rushing over to him, 𝗵𝗃 had stood by his side with a pout on her face as 𝗓𝗓 looked at him with nothing more than a disappointed expression on her face before pulling Izuku away, not without saying goodbye to a fellow knight though. "Izuku, you can't just disappear on us like that. You could have gotten yourself killed," 𝗓𝗓 hissed quietly. "I noticed a scent coming from here and was checking it out. I'm sorry that I left you two unattended," Izuku said, looking at the ground, tail no longer wagging. "I know that it's strong to realize this fact, but you are humanity's last emissary. If you are killed, then that means that you can't save the world, nor can you stop the incineration of it. You need to be far more careful with your life," 𝗓𝗓 said, urging him to follow those exact words. "What if someone was in danger? I didn't want to wake you both up. I know that some girls like their beauty sleep," Izuku muttered as 𝗓𝗓 sighed. "I'm not mad at you, Izuku, just disappointed that you didn't even inform us as to where you were going. We were worried sick that you could have been captured, killed, or worse," 𝗓𝗓 stressed as Izuku looked at the ground even more guilty. The trio then turned to leave the town when something landed behind them for the second time that week. Turning around slowly, they found themselves at the bottom of 4 legs that had black scales and gray scales that moved up the very muscular legs before showcasing leathery wings that spread out wide. All moving up towards a massive maw that glared down at the trio with nothing more than contempt as it let out a shrill screech as Izuku immediately moved to get out of the way of its initial strike. It slammed both arms down as 𝗵𝗃 and 𝗓𝗓 blocked the initial strike, both having the ground crack under their feet. Izuku leaped up high in the air as he created his bow and formed a green magic arrow as it charged on the bow itself. Before he could fire it, however, the wyvern looked over at him with an unamused expression and prepared to use a breath attack on him before something pierced through its leg, and it looked down at what smacked into his leg to pierce through his scales. It roared as 𝗓𝗓 pulled her flagpole out of the hole created by her weapon of choice before she leaped upwards and slammed the side of the pole into the leg of the creature. 𝗵𝗃 leapt up from the left as she slammed the edge of her shield right into the jaw of the creature as a few sharp teeth flew out of its mouth. Snapping its jaw tightly shut, it glared at 𝗵𝗃 as the girl pulled up her shield to block another strike. All before she heard a screeching sound of pain and looked out from her shield as soon as she took in quite a sight. 𝗓𝗓 had managed to climb onto its back and pierced through its spine with her flagpole and forced it to stay on the ground. All before she leaped around and stabbed the creature from below the lower jaw and having the tip of her flagpole poking slightly out from the upper jaw of it. Then just as she was about to yank out her flagpole from the wound, Izuku fell down in between Mashu and the wyvern, releasing the largest magic arrow he'd ever formed from thin air. Jean noticed the large attack incoming as she then heard Izuku mutter out the name of such a magical attack. Kumonosu. Izuku mumbled out as the arrow immediately transformed into a large net of green magical energy. The trio watched as the energy arrow pierced into the lower jaw of the wyvern as the green energy created a net over its jaw and left arm. Izuku then ran to the right as he charged another green energy arrow as Mashu rushed in and swung her shield for the right leg, causing it to buckle slightly. Jean then leapt over to the leg before using her flagpole in order to slice through the offending limb from the wound's origin point. Once she pushed through the leg, she then leapt over towards the rear of the creature before slicing through the base of the wyvern's tail as the wyvern lifted its head and a purple cloud began to form in its throat. Jumping down from where she had originally stood, she stopped right in front of Izuku and Mashu as the two stared at the wyvern in shock. Somehow the damage they had dealt to it had managed to become superficial in the time it took for Izuku to charge a new arrow, not to mention all the damage they were dealing regenerating. Once Izuku released his arrow, it flew towards the creature as it smashed right into the middle of its face as it stabbed right into the scales before spinning rapidly. All before piercing through and creating a loud explosion that Izuku was forced to block his ears from the sound. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Over on the other side of France, the dragon witch looked over where she could see a giant cloud of smoke. Looking at it with disdain, she glanced over at one of the servants she had summoned in order to make her mission a complete cakewalk to destroy all of France. Smirking at the one servant, she called them over mentally as she spoke to them, giving a mental command in order to send them over to where that explosion was. That was most likely a servant dealing with one of her king wyverns. She then glances at the other servants within her control before calling a wyvern. It was the true leader of the wyverns. Climbing aboard it, she calls her other servants, ranging from a berserk saber all the way to a berserk assassin. Leaving the berserk caster behind in order to continue the plan, and as they fly, she placed a hand onto her 𝗧𝗓𝗧 as her clothing's beauty window revealed a golden glow as a holy grail was revealed as she smiled at it. I think now is the perfect time to see who this other me is, not to mention whoever that person was who spied on me. The dragon witch muttered before she continued off towards the town that our protagonists were located, which just so happened to be the Fort Lottery. 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Back at the fight, Izuku had been smacked into a nearby building as some wooden beams fell on top of him. Mashu rushed over to help him out of the rubble as she yanked some of the beams of wood away from his body as he trembled in copious amounts of pain that he slowly got back into a standing position from. Looking in the sky, they both watched as more wyverns had begun circling the place they were at as Izuku and Mashu nodded at one another as they rushed out of the building. If one were to tell Jean that she'd be fighting a king wyvern, she would tell you that you were full of it. She never thought that she'd be fighting a wyvern king, as well as his loyal subjects who just couldn't understand why she was fighting them. And to make matters even worse, the city that had been reduced to rubble and its civilians all killed in cold blood, their corpses were walking towards them in a bit to kill them as well. And that wasn't taking into account the wyverns that were killing those guys. This day was just continuously getting worse, and each time they released an attack big enough to destroy the beast, something would come in and tank a portion of the attack, allowing the king wyvern to survive the attack. As apparently, Izuku's energy arrow charged at full power could easily destroy the beast, he just needed time to charge it long enough for it to be even usable in the fight. Oh yeah, and that is not also taking into account that she can sense 6 servants coming in their direction. The fact that her evil self had done this kind of damage to the country she so loved disgusted her. Not only that, but it made her wonder just how and betrayed that version of her felt to want this for her own country, the one she bled, fought and sweated to protect. Jumping away from the Wyvern King, she had prepared to be hit with a breath attack before someone leaped down from above and sliced the monster in two. Looking over her shoulder, she found Izuku holding his left arm in pain as he sent whoever he had brought into the singularity to take care of the monster. "Thank you for the assistance. Now we need to take care of the wyvern horde," Jean said, as she prepared to use a powerful attack. "You will do no such thing," a voice called out from above them all. Looking up, Izuku noticed how there was yet another gigantic wyvern, but this one was definitely far larger than the one that he had sent Heracles to destroy. And he couldn't help but think that if what biology class when he was in school provided him with the thought that this wyvern had to be a female considering how much larger she was than the king wyvern. But his eyes then moved over to the group sitting on the back of such a giant creature. The first one was the woman he recognized as the alter ego for Jeanne d'Arc, as she wore exactly the same outfit as the Jeanne who was on his side, but with a more blackened color and an amber-eye color. Looking at the other heroic spirits that were on the back of such a magnificent creature, he noticed how they looked eerily similar to certain figures from history. One was a woman who had a bow that made him think of Greece for a moment. Her hair was a light teal green with cat ears on top of her head with a tail of the same color as her hair. Another was another female heroic spirit who had slender figure and is cladded in a cybergoth lowly dress with white detached sleeves, with a circular skirt and several belts on the top connected to her collar that cover her cyst area similar to passion lips, and wears knee-high shoes with 2 sharp spikes. She has long pink claws instead of fingers. Her most prominent features are the immoral devil horns, actually dragon horns, and the protruding fangs of a little devil, actually dragon fangs, along with a long draconic tail and pink scales scattered throughout her body. She wields lance that can double as a microphone stand. Is she even a heroic spirit? Izuku asked, looking at the black berserk aura surrounding the pink-haired servant. I don't know, why didn't Romani inform us about these people coming to us? Mashu asked, concerned. There is no way we can win right now. I'm down an arm and I'm nearing exhaustion, Izuku said, as he tried to sense his own magical reserves. Jeanne, we might need to get out of here, Mashu called out, as the woman glanced over at Izuku and Mashu. The boy was looking as though a cool breeze would be capable of knocking him over, and he was looking quite sickly at the moment. But as they all looked back up, they found someone else who was standing next to the pink-haired girl with the horns. This one had horns on her head as well but wore a far more regal dress that was BLD red in color around the hips and opened up in her middle revealing a bunch of buckles covering her stomach all the way to just under her melons. Izuku though, due to what he believed was his very hormonal mind at the moment, noticed how this version of the servant on the left was far more filled out in her body type. Larger melons, hips far wider and thicker thighs. He gulped silently before he shook his head at the thought he just had. He wasn't a pervert, and he'd never been able to look at women like he just thought about when noticing the look of the white-haired servant who held onto a very Slovenian staff that was looking similar to a pointed staff. Izuku looked at Mashu before his mind began supplying him with information about her body, something he wasn't really focusing on at this point in time as his ears and tail twitched whenever he looked at the women. Shaking his head again, he focused on the task of seeing if there was a way to escape from the area in time to recover. Carmilla, Elizabeth Bathory, take these 3 down. Any means possible. The alter ego of Jeanne d'Arc said, as the 2 leaped off from the wyvern. As the 2 landed on the ground, Carmilla walked over near Izuku and Mashu as the woman her lips. She summoned a knife into her hands that looked very bloody, and Izuku felt his mind remember something about the woman that he'd read up on when he was searching for a quirk for himself when he was younger. Mashu, don't let her cut you, Izuku muttered. But do you know something about her? Mashu asked, as Izuku glanced at her with his eyes but looked back at the woman. Something I read upon that white-haired woman's legend. She bathed in the BLD of 600 women that she killed to keep her beauty. Don't Izuku said more urgently. Okay senpai, let's do this, Mashu said, as she prepared for a fight. I wanted to fight the cute-looking Foxy. Elizabeth called out, pouting at Jeanne. You will be fighting me, Elizabeth? Jeanne said, twirling her flagpole in a circle before holding it like a lance. Well, at least we're going to be fighting. Let's do this, faker. Elizabeth called out, before rushing at Jeanne who had done the same. As the white-haired woman seemingly disappeared from sight, Izuku, knowing that he was down an arm, relied on his sense of sound. His ears twitched to the left when he heard a series of footsteps to his left as he called out to Mashu. Mashu, to the left. Izuku yelled as he leaped out of the way to his right as a knife came by his hair, nicking his ear a little. Listening to 𝗧𝗵𝗃 leaped in and swung her shield to the left as she smacked the white-haired woman in the face. Sliding back a few meters, the women immediately hid her presence once more as Izuku stood up and prepared a lightning arrow that he just thought up on the spot. As he was about to launch the arrow into the air, he heard movement from his right as he immediately grabbed the arrow, ignoring how much electricity was coursing through his veins at the moment, and stabbed it backwards as though he were reverse holding a knife of his own. The effect that happened was immediate. 𝗧𝗪𝗢𝗢. The servant screamed as lightning struck the ground right behind Izuku. Mashu immediately noticed Izuku, who was holding his left arm still but was holding a lightning arrow in his hand on the servant behind him. Rushing in, she threw her shield at the servant, knocking her away from Izuku as he pulled the arrow into his bow and launched it at the woman. She dodged the attack but leaped over back behind Izuku and Mashu as the two turned around to face her once more, although Izuku was happy to see that his on-the-spot thinking had managed to do a lot of damage to the servant. Izuku prepared another arrow, but this time hiding the element to make the servant wary of his power. Mashu got in front of him as she placed the shield in a protective stance as the Berserker assassin had stood her ground as her body twitched and writhed in agony, her muscles being electrocuted so much that they were stiff. They were about to launch an attack on the white-haired servant when Elizabeth had fallen into the middle of the field with a bunch of injuries on her form as she struggled to stand back up. Looking over at Jean, Izuku noticed how the woman herself was appearing damaged as well, lots of cuts and bruises on her form. "You two are making me look like a joke. I should send the other servants down there to deal with this." 𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗏 Alter growled out. "We can handle this." Both of the servants called out at the same time. "No. I am done with you two playing with your food." 𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗏 Alter growled out as Izuku and Mashu grabbed the real Jean and tried to escape. They made it down the road and around the corner before a horde of wyverns had blocked their exit. The Jalter standing right in their pathway. "Did you really think that I'd allow any of you to escape? You are providing a challenge to my plans of destroying France, and I will not stand for you all surviving any longer." Jalter calmly stated as she held her flagpole in her hand. Just as Jean was about to hold out her own flagpole, Izuku let loose a flaming arrow towards the alter ego of Jean d'Arc, causing everyone to look at him in surprise, as Izuku slightly from the overusage of his magic supply. He watched as the green flaming arrow slammed right into the defense of Jean d'Arc Alter as she held her flagpole in the way of such an attack with nothing more than a smile on her face. She watched as the arrow just stayed where it was before it began to spin around, causing her to stare at it for a moment, before it pierced through even her own defensive flagpole before everything around her erupted in fire. Izuku then grabbed both Mashu and Jean as they all rushed towards the exit of the fort. As they were about to leave the place, Izuku felt himself get grabbed by his tail as he let out a pained yelp before he looked over his shoulder to see the white-haired woman glaring at him. Her knife was raised high in the air, and he pulled out a magical arrow, one that was weak enough to be used safely by him, as he swung it backwards to block the knife. As the knife came down on the arrow, Izuku held the arrow as strong as he could as he felt the woman's pure strength attempting to break through the arrow as he was eventually placed on the ground on his back. His ears flicked back as he held the arrow as tightly as possible, pushing all his magic into it as he could. The woman smirked at him as she prepared to break the magic arrow he had created to block her attack when a new voice came out from nearby. "I must ask that you release that little fox." A feminine voice rang out, causing the white-haired woman to look up. "Who are you?" the woman asked with a growl. "Someone who you should be looking up to as the Queen of France," the new voice said, as Izuku kicked the white-haired woman's stomach, stumbling her backwards a bit. Rolling on the ground, Izuku threw the arrow at the woman as she sliced it in half before a large explosion sounded from it being cut. Izuku rushed towards where the voice was and reached out and grabbed the woman. She let out a curious eep as he ran towards the exit of the fort as he caught up with Mashu and Jean, who were waiting for him as they continued down the path away from Fort Laterate. All whilst the short but white-haired Queen of France just sat idling in Izuku's arms as he rushed away from the fort with her presence on his shoulder. "Nice to meet you, little fox. I am Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France," the woman said, as everyone stopped running for a moment. "You're the Queen of France. The Queen of Lilies?" Izuku asked, confused as the woman on his shoulder nodded. Although I would appreciate it if you were to so kindly place me on the ground. As much as I would love to stay on your shoulder, I think you should be sitting on mine. The woman said with a smile on her face. Sorry. Izuku called out, letting the woman land softly on her feet. Better. Now then follow me, I have a place where you all can rest. Marie said as she led the group forwards through the forest that conveniently was where they stopped. All before everyone heard a thud to the ground behind them all. Jean and Mashu looked behind themselves as they found Izuku having fallen unconscious with BLD falling from his nose in a slow progression as Marie took note of it. Did I give him a nosebleed from how appealing I look? She asked with a tilt of her head.